Kayla Cuevas and Nisa Mickens. On September 13, 2016, 16-year-old Kayla Cuevas walked down Stolly Street in Brentwood, New York with her best friend, 15-year-old Nisa Mickens. The two girls had known each other their entire lives since childhood. They attended Brentwood High School together. Kayla had been involved in several disputes with MS-13 members at their high school. About 1 week before this night, she and several friends got into an altercation with gang members inside the school. The gang vowed to seek revenge. That night, Alexei Sayans and his brother Yairo Sayans were driving through Brentwood with other Sailors Clique members. They were hunting for rival gang members. One group spotted Kayla and Nisa walking down the street. They recognized Kayla immediately, and they called the Sayans brothers for permission. The brothers granted it. Several gang members chased the two girls down with baseball bats and a machete. The men caught up to them on the quiet street. They began striking both girls repeatedly. The baseball bats hit their heads and bodies with brutal force. The machetes sliced through skin and bone. The Sayans brothers drove nearby, watching for police. When it ended, both girls lay dead on Stolly Street. Nisa's body was discovered that evening. She had sustained severe cuts to her face from the machete. Her head showed massive trauma from the baseball bat strikes. Kayla's body was found the next morning behind a house adjacent to where Nisa was discovered. She had significant blunt force trauma and multiple deep cuts. After the murders, the gang members retreated to the Sayans brothers' home. They changed their clothes and hid the weapons. Both girls were dead. Gabriela Gonzalez Ardon. On May 29, 2020, 16-year-old Gabriela Gonzalez Ardon received a message from MS-13 members. Wilson Constanza Galdamez, Edis Valenzuela Rodriguez, and Jonathan Pesquera Puerto wanted to meet her. Gabriela had been reported missing from her home in New York. The gang believed she was associating with rival gang members. They suspected connections to the 18th Street gang. That afternoon, they convinced Gabriela to meet them at Loch Raven Reservoir in Cockeysville, Maryland. The location was remote. The Merryman Trail ran along the reservoir through wooded areas. Few people came through. Gabriela arrived at the meeting spot. When she reached them, they attacked without warning. They struck her with a machete. The blade cut into her body repeatedly. They stabbed her multiple times with knives. The assault was fast and vicious. Gabriela tried to defend herself, but there were too many attackers. She collapsed on the trail. The gang members left her body there among the trees. After the murder, they reported what they had done to their leadership. They wanted credit for the killing to increase their status. Gabriela's body was discovered by hikers on the trail. She was 16 years old. Michelle Tenezaka. On June 5, 2020, 1 week after Gabriela's murder, the same MS-13 members targeted another victim. Wilson Constanza Galdamez and Edis Valenzuela Rodriguez believed Michelle Tenezaka was a rival gang member who cooperated with law enforcement. Until MS-13's rules, cooperation with police meant death. That day, they lured Michelle to an area near the CSX Bayview train yard in Baltimore. The location was isolated. Railroad tracks ran through with thick brush on both sides. When Michelle arrived, they attacked her with extreme violence. They had brought multiple knives. What happened next was one of the most brutal murders in MS-13 history. They began stabbing Michelle. The first stab wounds came quickly, but they did not stop. They kept stabbing again and again. They stabbed her 143 times. The attack went on for several minutes. Each stab wound tore through flesh. Blood poured from the wounds. When they finally stopped, Michelle's body lay near the train tracks. The gang members left her there. After the murder, when they reported it to MS-13 leadership for recognition, railroad workers discovered Michelle's body the next day. The number of stab wounds shocked even experienced investigators. Victor Castro Martinez. On June 6, 2018, 25-year-old Victor Castro Martinez agreed to meet with MS-13 members in Houston, Texas. Victor had been working as an informant for the Houston Police Department. He was wearing a recording device. The police knew he was meeting with gang members. 4 MS-13 members, Wilson Ventura Mejia, Marlon Miranda, Miguel Aguilar Ochoa, and Carlos Henriquez Torres, had discovered Victor was an informant. They arranged to meet in a remote location. Victor drove to the meeting spot thinking he could handle the situation. When he arrived, the 4 gang members were waiting. They attacked, and the men pulled out machetes. The long blades came down repeatedly. Victor tried to escape and run. The gang members chased him down and continued slashing with the machetes. Deep cuts opened across his back, arms, and legs. Victor fell to the ground. The machetes cut into him again and again. Blood pooled beneath him. When they finally stopped, Victor lay motionless. The recording device had captured everything. Police recovered it later. All 4 attackers were arrested. Victor Castro Martinez died at the scene. Jose Alfonso Villanueva. On July 29, 2018, 24-year-old Jose Alfonso Villanueva received an invitation. Carla Jacqueline Morales contacted him. She said they were going to smoke marijuana to celebrate his birthday. Jose had been hiding from MS-13 for weeks after he disrespected gang members during a rap battle. Jose did not know Carla was working with the gang to lure him. That evening, Jose met Carla. She told him they were going to a field in Spring, Texas. It was a remote area surrounded by trees and brush. When they arrived, Jose got out of the vehicle. 5 MS-13 gang members were hiding nearby. The moment Jose stepped into the field, they rushed out with a machete and a gun. Jose realized what was happening. He turned and tried to run. One gang member caught up and slashed his back with the machete. Jose stumbled but kept running. Then the gunshot started. One bullet struck Jose. He fell to the ground. The gang members stood over him and fired more shots. Jose died in the field. His body was discovered about 1 week later. Carla Morales was arrested. She later jumped bail and cut off her ankle monitor. She was recaptured 9 months later and sentenced to 30 years. Genesis Cornejo Alvarado. On February 16, 2017, the body of a 15-year-old girl was found on Sharpcrest Street in southwest Houston. She had been shot twice at close range in the head and chest. Her identity was unknown at first. Eventually, she was identified as Genesis Cornejo Alvarado from New York. Genesis had been missing for 1 month. During that time, she was held captive by 2 MS-13 gang members, Miguel Alvarez Flores and Diego Hernandez Rivera. The 2 men were Satanists who kept Genesis and another 14-year-old girl in their apartment. Inside, they had built a shrine they called the Biest. One morning, Genesis criticized the shrine. The Alvarez Flores became offended and very angry. He approached the shrine and offered it a cigarette. Then he turned and told the others that the beast did not want a material offering. It wanted a soul. Genesis disappeared from the apartment after that. On February 16th, Alvarez Flores and Hernandez Rivera drove Genesis to Sharpcrest Street. Each had a gun. They each shot Genesis once. Alvarez Flores shot her in the head. Hernandez Rivera shot her in the chest. Genesis died instantly. A father driving his children to school discovered her body the next morning. The 14-year-old girl who had been held captive provided testimony that led to arrests. During their court appearance, both gang members laughed and waved at news cameras. They each received 40-year sentence. Michael Johnson. On January 28th, 2016, 19-year-old Michael Johnson left his home in Brentwood, New York. MS-13 members from the Sailors Clique spotted him on the street. They believed he was a rival gang member. They were wrong. Michael had no gang affiliation. The gang members decided to attack him anyway. They carried a baseball bat and knives. The attack began without warning. They struck Michael with the baseball bat in the head. He fell to the ground and they continued beating him with the bat. Then they began stabbing him. The knives cut into his head and torso repeatedly. Michael sustained severe injuries from both blunt force trauma and stab wound. He died on the street. Michael's family reported him missing. Less than 1 week later, police received a call about a body in the woods. A passerby had discovered Michael's body, but an autopsy determined his cause of death was sharp and blunt force injuries. Oscar Acosta. In early 2016, 19-year-old Oscar Acosta made a mistake. He had previously aligned himself with MS-13, but gang members suspected he was associating with the rival 18th Street gang. The Sailors Clique decided to greenlight his murder. On April the 29th, 2016, MS-13 members arranged to meet Oscar in a wooded area near an elementary school in Brentwood. They told him they were going to smoke marijuana. Oscar believed them. When Oscar arrived, the gang members attacked him. They beat him with blunt objects and stabbed him with sharp weapons. The assault was savage. Oscar's head and torso took massive trauma. He died in the woods. For almost 5 months, no one knew where he was. On September 16, 2016, law enforcement discovered Oscar's body during a search. An autopsy confirmed the cause of death was homicidal violence. Javier Castillo. On October 10, 2016, 15-year-old Javier Castillo was with members of the Sailors Clique in Central Islip, New York. The gang members convinced Javier to drive with them to Freeport. The town was approximately 30 miles away. They told him they were going to smoke marijuana. Javier agreed to go. He lived in Central Islip and knew some of the gang members. He trusted them. Once they arrived in Freeport, they met Alexi Sayans and other Sailors Clique members. The group told Javier they were going to a park. They drove to Cow Meadow Park. They led Javier to an isolated marsh area inside the park. The location was hidden from view by thick vegetation. Few people ever walked through that part of the park. It was the perfect place for what they planned. When they reached the marsh, the gang members attacked Javier without warning. They had brought a machete. The gang members took turns hacking Javier with the blade. The machete came down again and again. Javier suffered multiple sharp force injuries to his head, neck, torso, and arms and legs. He tried to defend himself, but there were too many attackers. The wounds were too severe. He died in the marsh. After killing Javier, the MS-13 members dug a hole in the marshy ground. They buried his body there. The vegetation grew over the burials. Javier's body remained hidden for 1 year. In late October 2017, law enforcement discovered the burial site and exhumed his remains. He was 15 years old. Dewan Stacks. On the evening of October 13, 2016, 34-year-old Dewan Stacks was walking on American Boulevard in Brentwood, New York. American Boulevard was a residential street with houses on both sides. Families lived there. Children played in the yards. Alexei Syans and other members of the Sailors Clique were driving through Central Islip in Brentwood that night. They were searching for rival gang members to attack and kill. They spotted Dewan walking down the street. They believed he was a member of a rival gang. They were wrong. Dewan had no gang affiliation. He was simply walking down the street. Alexei Syans authorized his murder immediately. The gang members split into groups. Alexei Syans drove around in one vehicle, watching for police presence and acting as a lookout. Another group of MS-13 members armed themselves with 2 machetes and a baseball bat. They drove to where Dewan was walking on the residential street. 3 armed gang members got out of the vehicle. They rushed at Dewan with their weapons raised. Dewan had no time to react. He did not see them coming. The gang members began beating him with the baseball bat. The blows struck his head and face repeatedly with brutal force. Then they started hacking at him with the machetes. The blades came down with savage force. They struck his face and head over and over. The attack lasted several minutes. When the gang members finally stopped, Dewan's body lay on American Boulevard. His face and head were nearly unrecognizable from the trauma. He had sustained severe, sharp, and blunt force injuries. Residents of the street called police immediately. Emergency responders arrived, but Dewan Stacks was already dead. He died on the residential street where he fell. Josael Guevara. On September 23, 2013, the mutilated body of 16-year-old Josael Guevara was discovered in the Sam Houston National Forest near Huntsville, Texas. Josael had been a sophomore at Klein Forest High School. He was a regular student with friends and family who cared about him. 3 MS-13 gang members had murdered him. Christian Zamora, Ricardo Campos Lara, and David Romero had received orders from a gang leader. The leader told them that Josael had supposedly cooperated with police in El Salvador. This cooperation had led to the arrests of several MS-13 gang members. The punishment for that cooperation was death. The 3 gang members arranged to meet Josael. They convinced him to go with them to the National Forest. They told him they were just hanging out. Josael was intoxicated when they drove him to the federal land. When they reached a remote area in the forest, the gang members attacked. Romero struck first. He swung a baseball bat at the back of Josael's head. The impact knocked Josael to the ground instantly. Then Zamora and Lara pulled out machetes. They began butchering Josael's body with the blades. The machetes cut through flesh and bone. The attack was described in court documents as particularly brutal, heinous, gruesome, and savage in nature. Josael died in the forest from the injuries. The gang members left his mutilated body there among the trees and vegetation. Hikers discovered Josael's remains the next day. All 3 gang members were arrested and convicted. Zamora and Lara each received sentences of 420 months in prison. Romero received life in prison. The Beijing Boy, China, 2015. On the evening of July 26, 2015, a 4-year-old boy was riding an escalator inside a busy shopping mall in Beijing. It was a normal summer evening. Families were shopping, children were playing, and nothing about the moment suggested danger. The boy was standing near the side of the escalator, holding the handrail as it carried him upward. His parents were just a few steps away. The escalator was operating normally. There were no warning signs, no alarms, and no visible defects. As the escalator reached the top landing, the boy stepped forward. At that exact moment, his right foot slipped into the narrow gap between the moving step and the metal side panel. The gap was only a few centimeters wide, but the internal machinery beneath the escalator was moving with enormous force. Before anyone could react, the boy's shoe was pulled in. His foot followed immediately. The escalator did not stop. The child lost his balance and fell forward as his leg was dragged downward into the machinery beneath the steps. His body twisted violently as the moving stairs continued pulling. His parents screamed and rushed toward him, trying to pull him free, but the force of the escalator was far stronger than human grip. Male security attempted to hit the emergency stop button, but precious seconds were lost in confusion and panic. By the time the escalator was finally stopped, the boy had already suffered catastrophic injuries. His leg had been crushed by the metal gears and rollers beneath the steps. Severe trauma caused massive blood loss within seconds. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the injuries were unsurvivable. The child was pronounced dead shortly after. Witnesses described the scene as silent after the screaming stopped. The escalator, a machine designed to move people gently, had killed a child in less than half a minute. The Shenzhen mother, China, 2015. On May 10, 2015, a 30-year-old mother was riding an escalator with her young son inside a department store in Shenzhen, China. She was holding her child's hand as they reached the top of the escalator. Surveillance footage later showed the escalator functioning normally up until the final seconds. As the pair approached the landing, a large metal floor plate at the top of the escalator suddenly collapsed beneath the woman's feet. The plate had been improperly secured and gave way instantly. The woman fell backward into the exposed mechanical cavity beneath the escalator. In the same moment, she realized her son was about to fall in with her. With no time to think, the woman used both hands to lift her child and throw him forward onto solid ground. Store employees and bystanders grabbed the boy as the escalator continued moving. The woman, now alone, was pulled downward into the machinery. The exposed gears beneath the escalator grabbed her clothing and legs. The force dragged her body completely below the surface. Witnesses could hear her screaming as she was crushed by the moving components. People tried to pull her out, but the machinery was too powerful. The emergency stop button was pressed, but the damage was already done. When responders finally reached her, she had suffered massive internal injuries and severe crushing trauma. She died at the scene. Her son survived without injury. The entire incident lasted less than 10 seconds. The Las Vegas Hotel Escalator Crush, United States. In 2003, inside a large Las Vegas hotel and casino, a middle-aged man lost his life on an escalator during a busy event night. The casino was crowded, and hundreds of people were moving between floors using the escalators. The victim was riding near the bottom when he stumbled and fell forward. Normally, a fall on an escalator results in bruises or minor injuries. This time, it didn't. As the man fell, people behind him continued stepping forward, unaware that someone was down. The escalator continued moving upward, pushing bodies forward. The fallen man was unable to stand as the weight of multiple people pressed onto him. He became trapped between the moving steps and the crowd above. The escalator did not stop. The pressure increased with every second. The man was pinned face down against the metal steps, unable to breathe. People screamed and tried to move backward, but the moving escalator forced them forward. The emergency stop was activated only after several seconds of chaos. By the time the escalator stopped, the man had suffered fatal compression injuries. He died from traumatic asphyxiation caused by the combined force of the crowd and the moving machinery. Emergency responders pronounced him dead at the scene. Many witnesses required medical attention for shock. The Hong Kong MTR head entrapment. In 2017, a fatal escalator accident occurred inside a Hong Kong mass transit railway station during evening hours. The victim was a middle-aged man riding alone on a long escalator connecting two underground levels. He was wearing loose clothing and standing near the side panel, holding the handrail. As the escalator descended, part of his clothing became caught between the step and the metal skirt panel. At first, he did not notice. When the fabric tightened, it pulled his body backward unexpectedly. He lost his footing and fell. His head struck the escalator steps, and before he could recover, his neck became wedged between the moving steps and the rigid sidewall. The escalator continued moving downward, pinning his head in place. Witnesses tried to pull him free, but the angle and pressure made it impossible. His neck was compressed between metal surfaces designed to never move apart. The emergency stop was activated, but by the time the escalator halted, the man had suffered fatal cervical trauma. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but he was already dead. Medical examiners later confirmed that his death was caused by severe neck compression and spinal injury. The Moscow Metro fallback death, Russia. On a winter morning in Moscow, a man in his late 40s entered a deep metro station and stepped onto one of the city's famously long escalators. These escalators descend hundreds of feet underground and take several minutes to complete the journey. About halfway down, the man lost his balance. Witnesses reported that he stumbled and fell backward. Instead of stopping, his body began tumbling down the moving steps. The escalator continued descending, carrying him downward as he struck step after step. Each impact caused blunt force trauma to his head, chest, and spine. Other passengers tried to avoid him as his body rolled uncontrollably downward. The length of the escalator made stopping impossible. By the time the emergency stop was pressed, the man had already reached the bottom. He was unconscious when security reached him. Emergency services declared him dead shortly afterward. The cause of death was severe head trauma combined with multiple internal injuries sustained during the repeated impacts. The escalator continued operating minutes later. The London Underground Clothing Entrapment, United Kingdom. In 2014, a fatal escalator incident occurred inside a London Underground station during the morning rush hour. The victim was a woman in her early 30s commuting to work like thousands of others. She was wearing a long coat and standing on the right side of the escalator facing forward. The escalator was crowded but moving normally, carrying passengers upward from the platform. As the escalator ascended, the hem of her coat became caught between the moving step and the metal side panel. At first, she did not notice. Within seconds, the fabric tightened violently. The sudden pull caused her to lose balance and fall backward. The escalator continued moving. The trapped coat pulled her body downward as she struggled to free herself. Passengers around her tried to help, pulling at the fabric, but the material was wedged deep inside the machinery. The force of the escalator was stronger than their grip. As the coat tightened around her upper body, her neck was forced downward toward the steps. Her airway became compressed. Witnesses screamed for the escalator to be stopped, but the emergency button was several meters away. By the time it was pressed, the woman had already lost consciousness. Emergency services arrived quickly, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was later confirmed as neck compression and asphyxiation caused by clothing entrapment. The Taiwan Metro Step Collapse. Taiwan. In 2016, a deadly escalator accident took place inside a busy metro station in Taipei. The victim was a man in his 50s riding an upward-moving escalator during evening hours. The escalator was crowded, but nothing appeared unusual. Without warning, several steps near the middle of the escalator suddenly collapsed inward. The metal steps separated, creating a large opening that exposed the moving machinery beneath. The man who was standing directly above the failure point lost his footing and fell forward into the gap. The escalator did not stop. His lower body was pulled immediately into the internal gears and rollers. Witnesses attempted to grab his arms, but the force dragged him downward with extreme speed. The machinery crushed his legs and pelvis as the steps continued cycling above him. By the time the emergency stop was activated, the man had already suffered massive traumatic injuries. Emergency responders arrived to find him partially trapped within the escalator structure. He was declared dead at the scene from catastrophic crushing injuries. Passengers nearby described hearing metal grinding and screams before the escalator stopped. The Brazil Stadium Escalator Crush, Brazil. In 2013, following a large football match in Brazil, thousands of spectators attempted to exit the stadium at the same time. A long escalator was being used to move crowds from the upper levels to ground level. The escalator was heavily overloaded, carrying far more people than it was designed to handle. As the escalator descended, it suddenly jerked and slowed. Several people near the bottom lost their footing and fell. The people behind them continued moving forward as the escalator kept descending. Within seconds, multiple bodies piled on top of each other. The escalator continued pushing people downward, compressing those who had fallen at the bottom. The victim, a man in his 40s, was pinned beneath several people, his chest pressed against the metal steps. He was unable to breathe as the weight increased. Security eventually stopped the escalator, but the damage was already done. The man was pulled from the pile unconscious and unresponsive. Paramedics attempted resuscitation, but he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The cause of death was traumatic asphyxiation due to crushing force. The Rome Metro Escalator Acceleration, Italy. On October 23, 2018, a fatal escalator incident occurred inside Rome's Repubblica metro station. The escalator was packed with commuters and tourists during peak hours. Without warning, the escalator began accelerating downward at a speed far beyond normal operation. Passengers lost balance almost instantly. People fell backward, colliding into one another as the escalator continued to speed up. Those who fell at the bottom were unable to stand as more bodies crashed down on top of them. The escalator acted like a moving conveyor of falling people. One man near the bottom became trapped beneath multiple passengers. His chest was compressed against the metal steps as the pile grew. Screams echoed through the station as bystanders attempted to intervene, but the escalator continued moving for several seconds before shutting down. When emergency responders arrived, the man was unresponsive. He was later pronounced dead from internal injuries and suffocation caused by crowd compression and mechanical movement. The South American shopping mall child death. In the early 2000s, a fatal escalator accident occurred inside a large shopping mall in South America involving a young child. The child was playing near the side of an escalator while adults nearby were distracted. The escalator was operating normally and was not crowded. As the child leaned toward the handrail, part of their clothing became caught inside the handrail return mechanism. The rotating rubber belt pulled the fabric inward with powerful force. Before anyone could react, the child's upper body was dragged downward toward the side panel. The escalator continued moving. The child's head became trapped between the handrail mechanism and the rigid metal structure. Witnesses attempted to pull the child free, but the grip of the moving belt was too strong. The emergency stop was activated seconds later. By the time the escalator stopped, the child had suffered fatal head and neck injuries. Emergency responders pronounced the child dead at the scene. In every one of these cases, the escalator was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It kept moving. Each victim stepped on in a normal moment, in a place meant to be safe, surrounded by other people going about their day. What followed happened in seconds. Once clothing, a foot, or a body was caught, there was no strength, no reaction, and no help fast enough to stop what came next. These were not freak accidents stretched over time. They were brief, violent endings inside ordinary public spaces. On the morning of May 27, 1541, a 67-year-old woman was told she would die within the hour. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, stood in her cell at the Tower of London, unable to understand what crime she had committed. She was the last of the Plantagenets, more royal than King Henry VIII himself, and she had served the Tudor family her entire life. Her only crime was being the mother of Cardinal Reginald Pole, who had spoken out against the king from the safety of Italy. For 2.5 years, Margaret had been imprisoned in the Tower, waiting for this moment. The 67-year-old countess had no idea that her execution would become one of the most brutal in English history. The regular executioner had been sent north to deal with rebels, so the job fell to an inexperienced young man who had never performed an execution before. As Margaret was led to the scaffold erected on Tower Green, about 150 witnesses gathered to watch what they expected would be a quick, dignified death. Margaret stood before the block and turned to the executioner with words that would echo through history. She declared loudly that she would not lay her head on the block. "So should traitors do, and I am none," she said firmly. She was innocent and refused to participate in her own execution. Guards grabbed her roughly and forced her to kneel, pushing her head down onto the wooden block. The young executioner raised his axe, but the struggle had thrown off his aim. The blade came down and missed her neck completely, gashing deep into her shoulder instead. Margaret screamed and jumped up from the block, blood pouring from the wound into her white hair. What happened next became the stuff of nightmares. The countess ran around the scaffold, desperate to escape, while the inexperienced executioner chased her with his axe raised. He swung wildly, hacking at her neck, shoulders, and back as she tried to get away. Each blow was meant to finish her, but none struck true. The witnesses watched in horror as the elderly woman was cut down again and again. By the time Margaret Pole finally died, the executioner had struck her 11 times. Her body was covered in wounds, her head and shoulders hacked to pieces. A contemporary account described how the executioner had performed his office in the most pitiful manner. Margaret Pole was later beatified by Pope Leo XIII in 1886, recognized as a Catholic martyr who had been murdered for her faith and her bloodline. On August 6, 1890, William Kemmler became part of history in a way no one had ever been before. The 40-year-old man had been convicted of killing his common-law wife with a hatchet, and the state of New York had decided to execute him using a brand new method. Kemmler would be the first person in the world to die in the electric chair. The execution was supposed to be quick and painless, a modern solution that would replace the brutality of hanging. The state had conducted experiments on animals and claimed they had perfected the process. At Auburn Prison, Kemmler was strapped into the wooden chair that would become known as Old Sparky. Electrodes were attached to his head and back. The executioner threw the switch, and 1,000 volts of electricity surged through Kemmler's body for 17 seconds. His body went rigid against the leather straps. His hands clenched so tightly that his fingernails cut into his palms. When the current was stopped, the witnesses believed it was over. The prison doctor stepped forward to examine the body and declare Kemmler dead. But then someone noticed something terrible. Kemmler was still breathing. His chest was rising and falling, and blood was beginning to foam at his mouth. The witnesses in the room started to panic. Someone shouted to turn the current back on immediately. There was confusion and chaos as the executioner scrambled to restart the generator, which had to build up power again. The second jolt came nearly a minute later, this time at 2,000 volts. The current tore through Kemmler's body for over a minute. The smell of burning flesh quickly filled the execution chamber. Witnesses watched in horror as blood vessels under Kemmler's skin burst and bled. Parts of his flesh actually burst into flames. Smoke rose from his body and the electrodes burned into his skin. 2 witnesses in the room fainted from the sight and smell. Several others suffered severe attacks of nausea and had to look away. After 2 minutes of this second electrocution, the current was finally stopped. This time, Kemmler was definitely dead. The entire execution had taken 8 minutes from start to finish. Newspapers across the country condemned the execution. The New York Herald called it Kemmler's death by torture. Another paper declared it was disgusting, sickening, and inhuman. One reporter wrote that an axe would have been far more merciful. Despite this disastrous first attempt, the electric chair would go on to be used in hundreds of executions across America. On April 22, 1983, John Louis Evans was strapped into Alabama's electric chair for a crime he had committed years earlier. The chair had a nickname, Yellow Mama, and it had been built by a prison inmate back in 1927. The chair had not been used since 1965, and that 18-year gap would prove to be a serious problem. Evans had been convicted of murder and showed no remorse for his actions. He had even admitted he would kill again if given the chance. After just 15 minutes of deliberation, the jury had convicted him and sentenced him to death. Now, nearly 2 decades later, it was time for that sentence to be carried out. At 8:30 p.m., Evans was led into the death chamber and strapped into Yellow Mama. Electrodes were attached to his head and leg. The leather straps were pulled tight across his chest and arms. A hood was placed over his face, so witnesses would not have to see his expression. At the signal, the executioner threw the switch, and 1,900 volts of electricity shot through Evans' body for 30 seconds. Almost immediately, things went wrong. Sparks began flying from the electrode attached to Evans' leg. The witnesses in the viewing room saw flames burst from the side of the chair. Evans' body slammed violently against the restraints. His fists clenched so hard that his knuckles turned white even through the straps. Smoke began pouring out from under the hood that covered his face. The smell of burning human flesh quickly filled the death chamber and drifted into the witness room. Some witnesses turned away, unable to watch. When the current stopped, 2 doctors entered the chamber to check if Evans was dead. To everyone's shock, he was still alive. His heart was still beating. The execution had to continue. 5 minutes later, after the generators had recharged, a second jolt of electricity was sent through Evans' body. Again, the room filled with smoke and the terrible smell of burning flesh. Again, Evans's body fought against the straps that held him. When this second jolt ended, the doctors checked again. Evans was still breathing. His heart was still beating. The witnesses could not believe what they were seeing. At this point, the execution had already been going on for more than 15 minutes. Finally, a third jolt of electricity was administered. This time, after another excruciating period of smoke and burning, John Louis Evans was finally pronounced dead. The entire execution had taken 24 minutes from the first switch being thrown to the final pronouncement of death. His body was left charred and smoldering in the chair. The botched execution became one of the most cited examples by opponents of capital punishment. It showed that even with 18 years of practice and previous executions, the electric chair could fail in the most horrible ways. On April 29, 2014, Clayton Lockett was scheduled to die by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. The 38-year-old had been convicted in 2000 of murder, rape, and kidnapping. His crime had been brutal, and he had been on death row for 14 years. But what happened during his execution would shock the nation and change the entire conversation about capital punishment in America. The problem started early that morning at 5:06 a.m. when correctional officers came to take Lockett from his cell. He had fashioned a noose from his bedsheets and resisted being moved. Prison guards had to use a taser to subdue him. When they got him to an examination room, they discovered he had cut his right arm. The gash did not require stitches, but it was a sign that this day was not going to go smoothly. By 5:30 p.m., Lockett was brought into the execution chamber. What should have been a routine procedure turned into a nightmare that would last for hours. A medical technician tried to insert an IV needle into Lockett's left arm but failed twice. She tried his right arm and failed again. She attempted to access the vein in his bicep but could not. A doctor stepped in to help, trying 3 times to insert a needle into the jugular vein in Lockett's neck. All 3 attempts failed. The doctor then tried to access the subclavian vein near Lockett's collarbone. That failed too. At this point, Lockett had been stuck with needles more than a dozen times. The execution team was growing desperate. Lockett, who had been a methamphetamine user before prison, had poor veins to begin with. He had also deliberately dehydrated himself before the execution, making his veins even harder to find. In a bizarre moment, Lockett actually tried to help his own executioners. "I've got a vein in my leg, in my right leg," he told the paramedic. She replied that she did not like using leg veins because they cause blood clots. Lockett responded with a question that showed how much pain he must have been in. "Does it really matter?" he asked. The decision was made to use the femoral vein in Lockett's groin. This required a needle that was 2.5 inches long, but the execution team only had needles that were 1.25 inches long. "Well, we'll just have to make it work," the doctor said. More than 50 minutes after they started, they finally got an IV line into Lockett's groin area. Because his groin was exposed, the warden decided to cover it with a blanket to protect his dignity. This decision would prove fatal. The blanket covered the IV site completely, meaning no one could see if the needle stayed in place or if anything went wrong. At 6:23 p.m., 23 minutes later than scheduled, the execution finally began. The first drug, midazolam, was administered through the IV line. By 6:33 p.m., just 10 minutes later, the doctor checked Lockett and declared him unconscious. The second and third drugs were then administered. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. But at 6:36 p.m., just 3 minutes after being declared unconscious, Lockett began to move. He started nodding his head and mumbling words that witnesses could not make out. Then he began to writhe on the table, his body twisting against the restraints. His movements became more violent. He strained and struggled, trying to lift his head and upper body off the gurney. Witnesses later described his movements as seizure-like. He was clearly in severe distress and possibly in terrible pain. At 6:42 p.m., the warden made the decision to lower the blinds, closing off the view from the witness room. Behind the closed curtains, the execution team discovered what had gone wrong. When they lifted the blanket, they found blood and clear liquid on Lockett's skin near his groin. There was swelling under the skin, larger than a golf ball but smaller than a tennis ball. The IV line had failed, the vein had collapsed, and the lethal drugs had been leaking into Lockett's tissue instead of going into his bloodstream. Some of the drugs had made it into his blood, which was why he had initially appeared unconscious, but not enough to kill him. Now he was experiencing the torture of having deadly chemicals burning through his tissue. At 6:56 p.m., after realizing what had happened, the director of the Department of Corrections called off the execution, but it was too late. The damage had been done. At 7:06 p.m., Clayton Lockett was pronounced dead of a massive heart attack. The execution had taken 43 minutes from the time the first drug was administered until he died. During that time, he had suffered in ways that execution protocols were specifically designed to prevent. The botched execution made national headlines and sparked outrage across the country. Senator John McCain called it torture. President Obama's press secretary said it fell short of basic standards of humanity. Human rights organizations condemned Oklahoma for turning Lockett into a test subject for their experimental drug protocol. The execution raised serious questions about lethal injection, the secrecy around execution drugs, and whether the death penalty could ever be carried out in a way that was not cruel and unusual punishment. Oklahoma immediately halted all pending executions while they investigated what went wrong. But for Clayton Lockett, the investigation came too late. The investigation revealed multiple failures. The execution team lacked proper training and equipment. They used needles too short for the procedure. Covering the IV site meant they could not see if the line worked. Most importantly, the drug combination was experimental. Oklahoma had turned to new drugs because companies stopped selling traditional execution drugs. The autopsy confirmed Lockett died from the drugs, not the heart attack. The drugs had entered his system incorrectly. By the time his vein collapsed, enough had entered his bloodstream to kill him. But instead of a quick death, he suffered for 3/4 of an hour. The botched execution was not isolated. In 2014, there were 4 major botched executions in America. Earlier that year, Ohio executed Dennis McGuire using the same drugs. That took 25 minutes with McGuire gasping throughout. In July, Arizona executed Joseph Wood with a similar protocol. Wood gasped 660 times over 2 hours before dying. More than a third of execution attempts in 2014 had serious problems. Since 1890, 3% of U.S. executions have been botched. Lethal injection has the highest rate at 7.1%, compared to 1.9% for electric chair. These 4 executions show that throughout history, executions have been prone to terrible mistakes. Margaret Pohl hacked 11 times, William Kemmler burning in the first electric chair, John Louis Evans requiring 3 jolts over 24 minutes, Clayton Lockett writhing for 43 minutes. Each represents a system failure. Dimebag Darrell. On December 8, 2004, 38-year-old Darrell Abbott walked onto the stage at the Al Rosa Villa nightclub in Columbus, Ohio. Abbott, known worldwide as Dimebag Darrell, was the guitarist for the heavy metal band Damage Plan. The venue held approximately 250 fans who had packed into the small club to see the performance. It was the band's first song of the night. Darrell stood at the front of the stage, his signature Dean guitar in hand, starting the opening riff. The crowd was loud and the energy was building. Security at the venue was minimal, with only a few guards positioned near the stage. The band had been on tour for months, and this was supposed to be another routine show in a string of performances across the country. Less than 2 minutes into the first song, a 25-year-old man named Nathan Gale climbed over the front barrier and rushed onto the stage. Witnesses said he moved quickly and deliberately toward Darrell. Gale pulled out a 9mm handgun and fired repeatedly at point-blank range. Darrell was shot multiple times in the head while still holding his guitar. He collapsed instantly and was dead before hitting the stage floor. The music stopped abruptly as chaos erupted. Gale continued firing into the crowd and at other band members. He shot and killed 3 more people, including a fan who tried to shield band members and an employee who attempted to tackle him. Another band member and two fans were wounded before Columbus police officer James Niggemeyer entered the venue through a back door and shot Gale once in the face, killing him immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Darrell was pronounced dead at the scene. The entire incident lasted less than 90 seconds from the moment Gale jumped on stage to when Officer Niggemeyer fired the fatal shot. The Alrosa Villa temporarily closed after the shooting and later implemented metal detectors at all shows. Darrell's death occurred exactly 24 years to the day after John Lennon was shot. He was buried with one of Eddie Van Halen's guitars placed in his casket. Nick Menza. On May 21, 2016, 51-year-old drummer Nick Menza was performing with his band OHM at the Baked Potato Jazz Club in Studio City, California. Menza was best known as the drummer for Megadeth during the band's most successful period in the early 1990s. The small venue held fewer than 100 people, and Menza was 3 songs into the set. He had been dealing with heart problems for years and had undergone surgery to replace a faulty heart valve, but continued touring and performing regularly. Friends said he seemed in good spirits that evening and was excited to be playing again. The audience was close to the stage in the intimate club setting, with fans standing just feet away from the band. During the third song, witnesses noticed Menza's drumming became irregular, and he appeared to be struggling to maintain the rhythm. His arms slowed and his posture sagged forward over the drum kit. Other band members glanced back at him but continued playing, initially thinking he was having equipment issues. Then Menza suddenly collapsed backward off his drum stool and fell onto the stage floor. The music stopped immediately. Band members rushed to his side along with several audience members who had medical training. Someone called 911 while others began performing CPR. Menza was unresponsive and showed no signs of breathing. His face had turned pale and his pulse was extremely weak. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and took over resuscitation effort. They worked on him at the scene for nearly 20 minutes before transporting him to a nearby hospital. Despite aggressive treatment, Menza was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Doctors confirmed he had suffered a massive heart attack brought on by congestive heart failure. The autopsy revealed severe coronary artery disease that had likely been developing for years. Video footage from the show captured the entire incident and was later reviewed by medical examiners to establish the timeline. The Baked Potato held a memorial concert for Menza 2 weeks later, and his family established a scholarship fund for young drummer Les Harvey. On May 3, 1972, 27-year-old guitarist Les Harvey was performing with his band Stone the Crows at the Top Rank Ballroom in Swansea, Wales. Harvey was the lead guitarist and a founding member of the Scottish blues rock band. The venue was filled with approximately 1,500 fans. It was early in the set and the band was playing their 4th song. Harvey stood at the front of the stage wearing a white shirt and holding his Gibson Les Paul guitar. The sound system was powerful and the stage was wet from condensation and spilled drinks. Lighting equipment hung overhead and cables snaked across the stage floor, connecting amplifiers and microphones. The band had been touring extensively throughout the UK, and this was the second night of a short Welsh tour. During a guitar solo, Harvey reached out to adjust his microphone stand. His hand made contact with the metal microphone while his other hand was still touching the strings of his guitar. Both the microphone and the guitar were improperly grounded with faulty electrical wiring that had gone unnoticed during the sound check. The moment Harvey touched the microphone, 240 volts of electricity surged through his body. The current entered through his hand on the microphone and exited through his hand on the guitar, passing directly through his chest and heart. He was thrown backward violently and collapsed on the stage. Band members and crew rushed to him immediately but were initially afraid to touch him, unsure if he was still conducting electricity. The power was cut within seconds and someone began attempting CPR. Witnesses said Harvey's body convulsed several times before going still. His skin showed visible burn marks where the electricity had entered and exited his hand. Emergency services were called, but the venue was in a difficult location to access quickly. By the time paramedics arrived approximately 12 minutes later, Harvey showed no vital signs. He was transported to Morriston Hospital, where doctors attempted resuscitation for over 30 minutes. Harvey was officially pronounced dead from electrocution at 11:47 p.m. The investigation revealed that the venue's electrical system was outdated and multiple pieces of equipment lacked proper grounding. Stone the Crows disbanded following Harvey's death. The incident led to widespread changes in electrical safety standards for concert venues across the UK, including mandatory grounding checks and the introduction of residual current devices for all stage equipment. Johnny Ace. On December 25, 1954, 25-year-old singer Johnny Ace was backstage at the City Auditorium in Houston, Texas. Ace, whose real name was John Marshall Alexander Jr., had 3 hit records on the R&B charts and was one of the most popular black singers in America. He was scheduled to perform at a Christmas night concert alongside Big Mama Thornton and Willie Mae Thornton. The backstage area was crowded with performers, band members, and promoters waiting for showtime. Ace had a reputation for playing around with guns and had been drinking earlier in the evening. Someone had given him a .22 caliber revolver, and he was showing it off to people in his dressing room. Band members later said he had been waving it around casually and joking about Russian roulette. During a break between sets, Ace was sitting in his dressing room with several band members and his girlfriend. Witnesses said he was spinning the cylinder of the revolver and pointing it at different people while laughing. Someone told him to stop playing with the gun, but Ace ignored the warning. He spun the cylinder again, placed the barrel against his left temple, and said something about showing everyone that the gun was not loaded. Then he pulled the trigger. The gun fired. Ace was shot in the head and fell forward immediately. Blood poured from the wound on his temple. People in the room screamed, and several rushed to help him while others ran to get help. Ace was still breathing but unconscious with a weak pulse. An ambulance arrived within minutes and paramedics transported him to Jefferson Davis Hospital. Doctors performed emergency surgery to remove the bullet and reduce brain swelling, but the damage was too severe. Johnny Ace died at 2:15 a.m. on December 26th without regaining consciousness. Police classified the death as accidental and no charges were filed. The gun was later determined to have had one bullet in the chamber when Ace pulled the trigger. His death occurred between sets and the concert continued after his body was removed from the venue. His posthumously released single reached #1 on the R&B charts. The incident became one of the most well-known accidental deaths in music history and added to his legend as a rising star whose career ended tragically at its peak. Vinicius Gomes. On July 7, 2018, 23-year-old Brazilian singer Vinicius Gomes was performing at a private party in Maio de Porã, a city in São Paulo state. Gomes was a rising star in the forró music scene, a popular genre in northeastern Brazil. The event was a birthday celebration held at a ranch with approximately 200 guests. Gomes had been hired to perform a 2-hour set and was about 45 minutes into his performance. The party was outdoors with temporary staging and sound equipment set up specifically for the event. Weather conditions had been unstable throughout the day with dark clouds forming in the distance. Lightning had been spotted on the horizon, but the party continued as the storm appeared to be several miles away. As Gomes sang into the microphone, the sky darkened rapidly, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Some guests started moving toward covered areas, but the majority of the crowd remained near the stage. Gomes continued performing despite the worsening weather. Then, a bright flash of lightning struck the metal structure supporting the stage's sound equipment. The electrical surge traveled through the wiring directly to the microphone Gomes was holding. Witnesses described seeing a blinding flash of light and hearing an explosive crack that was louder than any thunder. Gomes was lifted off the ground by the force of the strike and thrown backwards several feet. He landed motionless on the stage. The entire power system for the party failed instantly and the area went dark except for the continued lightning overhead. Multiple people rushed to Gomes but were initially unable to reach him, as the metal equipment around him was still dangerously charged. Within a minute, once it was deemed safe, partygoers pulled him away from the electrical equipment and began CPR. His body showed severe burns on his hand where he had been gripping the microphone and on his chest where the current had passed through. Emergency services were called immediately, but the remote location and storm conditions delayed their arrival. Paramedics reached the scene approximately 22 minutes after the strike. Gomes was not breathing and had no pulse. Despite extended resuscitation efforts, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Medical examiners determined he had died instantly from cardiac arrest caused by the lightning strike. The party was immediately canceled and guests were evacuated. Video footage of the incident captured by partygoers went viral on Brazilian social media, leading to widespread discussions about performing during storms. Authorities used the case to emphasize safety protocols for outdoor events and the importance of evacuating when lightning is visible. Irma Bule. On April 4, 2016, 29-year-old dangdut singer Irma Bule was performing at a concert in Karawang, West Java, Indonesia. Bule was known for her unique performances where she danced with live snakes draped around her body as part of her stage act. The outdoor concert had drawn several hundred fans. She regularly performed with pythons and other non-venomous snakes that were handled by a snake wrangler who traveled with her. That night, she was using a king cobra in her performance, a highly venomous snake capable of delivering fatal bites. The cobra was supposed to have its mouth taped shut as a safety precaution, but the tape had not been properly secured. Midway through her set, while Bule was dancing and singing with the cobra wrapped around her shoulders, the snake became agitated. The tape covering its mouth came loose. In a sudden movement, the cobra struck and bit Bule on her thigh. She flinched and stumbled slightly but continued performing. Audience members who noticed the bite assumed it was part of the act. The snake wrangler rushed onto the stage to remove the cobra, but Bule waved him off and kept singing. She finished the song and started another. By the second song after the bite, her movements became slower and less coordinated. Witnesses said she was sweating heavily and appeared to be struggling to remember lyrics. Approximately 45 minutes after the bite, Bule began having visible seizures on stage. She dropped the microphone and collapsed. The music stopped and the snake wrangler and other crew members carried her off stage. Someone called for an ambulance while others attempted to keep her conscious. Her breathing became labored and irregular. She began vomiting and her muscles were convulsing. By the time paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, Boulay was unconscious and unresponsive. She was transported to a local hospital where doctors administered anti-venom, but the delay in treatment had allowed the venom to spread throughout her system. Irma Boulay was pronounced dead at 1:20 a.m. from respiratory failure caused by cobra venom. The investigation revealed that the snake handler had failed to properly secure the cobra's mouth and that Boulay had refused immediate medical attention after the bite. The incident led to calls for banning live snakes in performances across Indonesia. The Kobe Bryant helicopter crash. On the 26th of January 2020, 1-year-old Kobe Bryant boarded a helicopter at John Wayne Airport in Orange County, California. He was traveling with his 3-year-old daughter Gianna and 7 others to a youth basketball tournament at his Mamba Sports Academy in Thousand Oaks. The retired Lakers superstar had flown this route many times before. The helicopter departed at 9:06 a.m., with pilot Ara Zobayan at the controls. Zobayan was experienced with over 8,200 hours of flight time and had flown Bryant regularly for years. Weather conditions that morning were poor with thick fog and low clouds blanketing the San Fernando Valley. The Los Angeles Police Department had grounded all their helicopters because conditions did not meet minimum safety standards. Despite the dangerous weather, the flight was approved under special visual flight rules, which allowed the pilot to navigate below the clouds. The helicopter stayed low, flying between 400 and 600 feet above ground as it headed northwest toward the destination. For the first 30 minutes, the flight progressed without incident, as Zobayan carefully navigated through the fog. At 9:44 a.m., while flying over Route 101 and rising terrain, the helicopter began climbing rapidly to get above the cloud layer. The pilot told air traffic control he was climbing to 4,000 feet to clear the clouds. The helicopter reached about 2,300 feet when it suddenly began a tight left turn. The aircraft started descending rapidly while still turning to the left. At 9:45 a.m., air traffic control asked the pilot to state his intentions, but there was no response from Zobayan. Seconds later, the helicopter slammed into a hillside in Calabasas at over 184 miles per hour while descending at more than 4,000 feet per minute. The impact created a 24-foot crater on the steep slope. The helicopter was completely destroyed on impact, and a small brush fire ignited from the wreckage. All 9 people on board died instantly from blunt trauma caused by the violent collision. Firefighters arrived at the scene at 9:47 a.m., but found no survivors in the wreckage. Along with Bryant and his daughter Gianna, the victims included Orange Coast College baseball coach John Altobelli, his wife Carrie, and their daughter Alyssa, who was a teammate of Gianna, Sarah Chester, and her daughter Peyton, who also played basketball with Gianna, basketball coach Christina Mauser, who coached at the Mamba Sports Academy, and pilot Ara Zobayan. The bodies were so badly damaged from the impact that Bryant had to be identified by his fingerprints. The autopsy revealed that all victims died from blunt force trauma, and the deaths were instantaneous. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation determined that the pilot became disoriented after entering the clouds and lost his sense of orientation, causing him to lose control of the aircraft. The crash sent shockwaves through the sports world and led to calls for mandatory terrain warning systems on helicopters used for charter flights. The Lorenzen Wright murder. On the 18th of July 2010, 4-year-old Lorenzen Wright arrived in Memphis from his home in Atlanta to visit his 6 children. The former Memphis Grizzlies center had played 13 seasons in the NBA before retiring the previous year. Wright had played for the Los Angeles Clippers, Atlanta Hawks, Memphis Grizzlies, Sacramento Kings, and Cleveland Cavaliers during his career. That evening, Wright went to the home of his ex-wife Shara Wright in Collierville, Tennessee. He had divorced Shara 5 months earlier after 13 years of marriage. The couple had been struggling with serious financial problems despite Wright earning over $55 million during his NBA career. Banks were trying to repossess his Atlanta home, and he owed significant money in child support and maintenance payments. Shara later told police that Wright left her house after midnight with another person she did not know, carrying money and a box. Shortly after midnight on July 19, a 911 dispatcher in Germantown received a disturbing call from Wright's cell phone. The dispatcher heard Wright scream, and then 11 gunshots rang out before the line went dead. Incredibly, the dispatcher did not report the call to her supervisor until 8 days later, which seriously delayed the investigation and allowed evidence to deteriorate. Wright's mother, Deborah, filed a missing person report on July 22 when she could not reach her son, something that never happened since they spoke daily. On July 28, 10 days after he went missing, police cadaver dogs found Wright's badly decomposed body in a swampy field near a golf course in southeast Memphis. An autopsy revealed he had been shot twice in the head, twice near his heart, and once in his forearm with a total of 5 bullets striking him. His body had been lying in the brutal summer heat for 9 days. The corpse was so badly decomposed it weighed only 57 pounds, down from his playing weight of 225 pounds. The case went unsolved for over 7 years despite intense investigation. In November 2017, investigators finally found the murder weapon in a lake in Mississippi, 88 miles from where the body was discovered. In December 2017, police arrested Billy Ray Turner, a landscaper and close friend of Shara Wright, and charged him with first-degree murder. Shara Wright was also arrested at her home in California and charged with murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Prosecutors revealed that Shara had recruited Turner and her cousin Jimmy Martin to kill Wright in order to collect a $1 million life insurance policy she had taken out on him. Witness Jimmy Martin testified that Shara lured her ex-husband to the remote field where she and Turner were waiting in ambush. Wright tried to flee when he realized what was happening but was shot multiple times and left to die alone in the field. In July 2019, Shara pleaded guilty to facilitation of murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole. In March 2022, after a lengthy trial, Turner was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The case became one of the most high-profile murder investigations in Memphis history and highlighted the dark side of professional athlete. The Drazen Petrovic car crash. On the 7th of June 1993, 8-year-old Drazen Petrovic was riding in a car on a rainy German autobahn. The New Jersey Nets shooting guard was one of the first European players to become an NBA star. He had just finished a tournament with the Croatian national team. Instead of flying back with teammates, Petrovic chose to drive to Zagreb with his girlfriend and her friend. He had completed his best NBA season, averaging over 22 points per game, while shooting nearly 50% from the field. As the car traveled through Bavaria in heavy rain, a truck suddenly crashed through the guardrail on the opposite side. The truck crossed into their lane and collided head-on with their vehicle. Petrovic was sitting in the back seat without a seatbelt. The impact killed him instantly. His girlfriend and her friend survived with injuries. News of his death shocked the basketball world. Petrovic was entering his prime and was considered one of the most talented shooters in the league. He was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame in 2002. Many experts believe that if he had lived, Petrovic would have become one of the greatest shooting guards in history. The Reggie Lewis cardiac death. On the 27th of July 1993, 7-year-old Reggie Lewis was practicing at a gym during the NBA offseason. The Boston Celtics captain had collapsed during a playoff game 4 months earlier. After that collapse, doctors found signs of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, where the heart muscle becomes abnormally thick. Some doctors gave him a less serious diagnosis. Lewis chose to believe the less serious opinion and continued playing. He had just finished leading the Celtics as captain, averaging nearly 21 points and 5 rebounds per game, and making his first All-Star team. On that July afternoon, Lewis was shooting baskets when he suddenly collapsed onto the court. Friends called for help and tried to revive him. Paramedics arrived and worked desperately to restart his heart. Despite their efforts, Lewis died at the scene. The autopsy confirmed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. His heart muscle was abnormally enlarged, making sudden cardiac death a constant risk. The Celtics retired his number 35 jersey. His death raised awareness about heart conditions in athletes and led to more extensive cardiac screening for professional players. The Len Bias cocaine overdose. On the 17th of June 1986, 22-year-old Len Bias was selected second overall in the NBA draft by the Boston Celtics. The University of Maryland forward was considered one of the most talented college players in the country. Scouts compared him to Michael Jordan for his athletic ability and scoring potential. The Celtics believed Bias would be the player to continue their dynasty after Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish eventually retired. 2 days after the draft, on the evening of June 18, Bias returned to his dorm room at the University of Maryland to celebrate with friends and teammates. He had just signed a major endorsement deal with Reebok worth over $1 million, and his future looked incredibly bright. That night, Bias and several teammates began using cocaine in their dorm suite. They were snorting lines of the drug while talking and celebrating his draft selection. Around 6:30 a.m., on June 19, Bias started having a seizure while talking to his teammate Terry Long. His body began convulsing violently, and he collapsed onto the floor. His friends immediately called 911 for help and tried to assist him. Paramedics arrived quickly and found Bias unconscious and not breathing. They worked frantically to revive him, performing CPR and using equipment to try to restart his heart, but nothing worked. Bias was rushed to Leland Memorial Hospital, where doctors continued desperately trying to save his life. At 8:55 a.m., less than 48 hours after being drafted by the Celtics, Len Bias was pronounced dead. The autopsy revealed he died from cardiac arrhythmia caused by cocaine intoxication. His heart had stopped beating due to the toxic effects of the drug on his system. Toxicology tests showed no other drugs or alcohol in his body, only cocaine. The news devastated the basketball world and shocked the entire nation. Bias had never played a single minute in the NBA. He went from being the second pick in the draft to dead in less than 2 days. His death led to major changes in how colleges dealt with drug use and increased testing requirements for professional athletes. The Boston Celtics were crushed by the loss, and many believe the team's championship window closed with Bias's death. His story became a powerful warning about the dangers of drug use and the tragedy of wasted potential. The Malik Sealy drunk driver collision. On the 20th of May, 2000, 30-year-old Malik Sealy was driving home from teammate Kevin Garnett's 24th birthday party. Sealy was a Minnesota Timberwolves small forward who had played 8 NBA seasons. Around 2A, Sealy was driving on a Minnesota highway when a pickup truck appeared in his lane. The truck was traveling the wrong way. The driver, 5-year-old Suk Songwan Feng Sain, was drunk with a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit. Sealy had no time to react. The pickup truck smashed head-on into his vehicle at high speed. Sealy was killed instantly. Feng Sain survived with minor injuries and was arrested. He pleaded guilty to criminal vehicular homicide and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The Timberwolves retired Sealy's number 2 jersey. Garnett was heartbroken, having lost his close friend hours after celebrating together. The team created an award in Sealy's name. His death highlighted the deadly consequences of drunk driving. The Bobby Phills car crash. On the 12th of January 2000, 30-year-old Bobby Phills left a Charlotte Hornets practice and got into his Porsche. The defensive specialist had just finished a morning workout. Phills was known as one of the best perimeter defenders in the NBA. After practice, Phills and teammate David Wesley decided to race their cars on the road from the arena. Both players drove at extremely high speeds on a public street. Witnesses saw the vehicles speeding side by side. Phills drove a black Porsche at an estimated 75 to 100 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone. As he accelerated, Phills lost control. The Porsche spun and swerved into oncoming traffic, crashing head-on into another vehicle. The impact at high speed was catastrophic. Phills suffered massive trauma and died instantly. The other driver was seriously injured but survived. Coach Paul Silas broke down crying when he heard the news. The team retired Phills' number 13 jersey. Wesley was charged with reckless driving. Phills was remembered as a fierce competitor and respected leader. His death served as a tragic reminder of the dangers of reckless driving. The Hank Gathers court collapse. On the 4th of March 1990, 23-year-old Hank Gathers was playing in the West Coast Conference Tournament semifinals for Loyola Marymount. The powerful forward was one of the best college players in the country and projected as a top NBA draft pick. Earlier that season, on the 9th of December 1989, Gathers had collapsed during a game. Doctors diagnosed him with an abnormal heart rhythm and put him on medication. The medication affected his athletic performance, so against medical advice, he reduced his dosage. Before the tournament game, Gathers had not taken his medication for at least 8 hours. In the first half against Portland, Gathers threw down a powerful alley-oop dunk. He ran back celebrating. Seconds later, he suddenly stumbled and collapsed face-first onto the court. Medical staff rushed to help and performed CPR. They used a defibrillator to restart his heart. Gathers was rushed to a hospital, but doctors could not revive him. He was pronounced dead from a heart muscle disorder. The autopsy revealed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. His enlarged heart caused a fatal rhythm disturbance. Gathers had led the nation in scoring and rebounding the previous season. His team continued playing in his honor and made the Elite Eight. His death raised questions about athlete health monitoring. The Jason Collier heart failure. On the 15th of October 2005, 28-year-old Jason Collier was at his Atlanta home during the NBA offseason. The 7-foot center played for the Atlanta Hawks after time with the Houston Rockets. That October morning, Collier suddenly collapsed at home. Paramedics rushed to the scene and found him unresponsive. Despite efforts to revive him, he could not be saved. Jason Collier was pronounced dead from a sudden heart rhythm disturbance. The autopsy revealed shocking information. His heart was abnormally enlarged, measuring 1.5 times the normal size even for his height. The enlarged heart caused an irregular rhythm that stopped his heart. This condition is more common in tall athletes but often goes undiagnosed. Collier had played professionally for 5 years without knowing his heart was dangerously oversized. His sudden death shocked teammates and coaches. His case led to increased awareness about the need for thorough heart screenings for athletes. The Bryce DeJean Jones shooting. On the 28th of May 2016, 23-year-old Bryce DeJean Jones was in Dallas visiting family. The New Orleans Pelicans guard had just completed his rookie season, appearing in 14 games. In the early morning around 3 a.m., DeJean Jones was trying to reach his girlfriend's apartment in a Dallas complex. He had been there before but became confused about which apartment was hers. DeJean Jones went to what he thought was the correct apartment and tried to open the door. When it would not open, he kicked the door down and entered. He was in the wrong apartment. The resident, a 36-year-old man, was asleep when he heard his door being kicked in. Fearing a home invasion, the man grabbed his gun and called out a warning. When Dejan Jones continued moving through the apartment, the resident fired. A single bullet struck Dejan Jones in the abdomen. He stumbled out and collapsed in the hallway. Paramedics rushed him to a hospital, but the wound was too severe. Bryce Dejan Jones died from his injuries. Police determined the shooting was self-defense. The resident was not charged. The tragic accident took his life as his career was beginning. The pressing of Giles Corey. On September 19, 1692, 80-year-old Giles Corey lay naked in an empty field next to Salem Prison. A wooden board rested on his chest while Sheriff George Corwin and Captain John Gardner placed heavy stones on top, one by one. Corey had been a prosperous farmer in Salem Village, Massachusetts, married to his third wife Martha, when accusations of witchcraft swept through the community. In April of that year, young girls claimed they saw his specter attacking them, pinching and choking them while demanding they sign the Devil's Book. Witnesses reported seeing Corey's ghost attending Sabbaths with other witches. His wife Martha had already been arrested for questioning the sincerity of the afflicted girls, and soon Corey himself stood accused. When his case came before the grand jury in September, nearly a dozen witnesses testified against him, but Corey understood the trap. If he pleaded guilty or not guilty and was convicted, all his property would be seized by the colonial government, leaving his family destitute. So when asked to enter his plea, Corey simply stood mute and said nothing. Under English law, anyone refusing to plead could not be tried, but they could be subjected to an ancient torture called pena forte et dure, strong and hard punishment, designed to force a confession. On September 17th, Corey was taken to the field. The torture began slowly. Heavy rocks were added gradually while magistrates urged him to speak. The weight crushed his chest, making each breath agonizing. Blood vessels burst beneath his skin. His ribs creaked under the pressure. For 2 full days, Corey endured this torment in front of spectators who had come to watch. Each time his tormentors paused to ask if he would plead, he reportedly said only 2 words: more weight. On the 3rd day, around noon, with hundreds of pounds of stone pressing down, Corey's tongue protruded from his mouth. Sheriff Corwin pushed it back in with his cane. Minutes later, Giles Corey died, crushed to death without ever entering a plea. His wife Martha was hanged 3 days later. The brutal public nature of Corey's death shocked many Salem residents and began turning public opinion against the witch trials. In 1712, the Massachusetts government officially cleared his name, though it came 2 decades too late. The first Salem execution. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop became the first person executed in the Salem witch trials. The 60-year-old woman had lived in Salem town with her 3rd husband, Edward, working as a midwife. Bishop was known for dressing flamboyantly in violation of Puritan standards, wearing a black cap and hat with a red bodice trimmed in different colors. She had been accused of witchcraft 12 years earlier and acquitted, but now faced new charges. On April 19th, she was arrested after young girls, including Ann Putnam, Mercy Lewis, Abigail Williams, and Mary Walcott, claimed her specter was torturing them. When Bishop entered the courtroom for examination, the girls immediately fell into fits, shrieking and contorting. Judge John Hathorne wasted no time asking if she had bewitched her first husband to death. Bishop denied everything, turning her head to look around the courtroom and declaring all present as witnesses to her innocence. But every movement she made seemed to cause the afflicted girls pain. When she shook her head, they screamed. When she cast her eyes about, they writhed. Witnesses came forward with stories spanning decades. John Bly and his son William testified they had found poppets, dolls made of rags and hogs, bristles with headless pins stuck through them, hidden in the walls of her former home. Samuel and Sarah Shattuck claimed Bishop had bewitched their child after they confronted her. Others said she ran a disorderly house where people drank and played illegal games late into the night. One man swore Bishop's specter had visited him in bed. The evidence was entirely spectral, visions only the accusers could see, but Chief Justice William Stoughton accepted it without question. On June 2nd, Bishop stood trial before the newly established Court of Oyer and Terminer. The proceedings lasted just 1 day. Despite having no concrete evidence, the jury found her guilty. 8 days later, on June 10th, Bishop was taken to a rocky outcrop that would later be identified as Proctor's Ledge. She was blindfolded, her petticoats bound close to her body, a noose was placed around her neck, and she was hanged until dead. Her execution set a terrible precedent. By allowing spectral evidence and the testimony of hysterical accusers, the court made conviction almost certain for anyone accused. Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall resigned from the court in protest after Bishop's hanging, recognizing the injustice. But the trials continued, and 19 more people would follow Bishop to the gallows before the madness ended. The Trier Massacre. In 1587, the German city of Trier began what would become the largest documented witch hunt in European history. Archbishop Johann von Schonenberg had taken control of the diocese 6 years earlier, with a mission to purge Protestants, Jews, and suspected witches from his territory. His chief enforcer was Peter Binsfeld, the auxiliary bishop who had written extensively about demonic possession and the necessity of executing witches. Between 1581 and 1593, the region experienced catastrophic weather. The Little Ice Age brought unusually cold temperatures, devastating hailstorms, and shortened growing seasons. In 1586, wet and cold springs destroyed crops. The year 1587 saw snow remaining on the ground until spring, then falling again in July and September. 1588 was the rainiest year in recorded history, with violent thunderstorms flooding fields. Wine and grain harvests failed repeatedly, leaving people hungry and desperate for someone to blame. Binsfeld provided the answer. In his treatise, published in 1589, he argued that witches were causing the weather disasters through pacts with Satan. He wrote that torture could be used freely on suspected witches because their crimes were exceptional. He allowed children to testify against their parents and even permitted children to be tried and executed as witches themselves. The trials escalated rapidly. Accusations spread through every level of society. Unlike most witch hunts that targeted poor women, Trier's persecutions consumed wealthy merchants, parish priests, judges, town councilors, and rural deans. Anyone could be denounced. Those arrested were subjected to horrific torture until they confessed and named accomplices. The accused were stretched on racks, had thumbscrews tightened until bones cracked, and were subjected to the strappado, where their arms were tied behind their backs and they were hoisted into the air by ropes until shoulders dislocated. Under such agony, people confessed to anything and named anyone their torturers suggested. One official named Claudius Musiel kept a register listing over 6,000 accusations from just over 300 executions in a few years. But this was only the executions he documented. Over 100 trial dossiers survive, showing many names not in Musiel's register, suggesting the true death toll was far higher. Historians estimate between 500 and 1,000 people were executed in the Diocese of Trier during this period, making it possibly the largest mass execution in European peacetime history. Victims were burned at the stake in groups. The executioner grew wealthy from his fees, riding through town on a fine horse dressed in gold and silver. Notaries, copyists, and innkeepers prospered from the trials. The children of convicted witches were exiled, and their property confiscated. One man tried to stop it. Dietrich Flade served as chief judge of the electoral court and rector of Trier University. When called to preside over witch trials, Flade treated the accused with unexpected mercy. He doubted the confessions obtained through torture and tried to impose proper evidentiary standards. His moderation made him enemies. In 1587, accused witches under torture began naming Flade himself, claiming they had seen him at Sabbaths consorting with demons. Whether these accusations arose naturally or were encouraged by Flade's opponents remains unclear. On September 18, 1589, Flade was burned at the stake after being mercifully strangled first. With the only voice of restraint eliminated, the burnings continued until economic collapse finally stopped them. So many people had been executed and so much property confiscated that the region's economy crumbled. The population shrank visibly. Finally, authorities imposed restrictions on the fees that could be charged for examinations and trials. When the money ran out, suddenly the zeal of the persecutors died. By 1593, the Great Witch Hunt of Trier had burned itself out, leaving behind a generation of trauma and hundreds of unmarked graves. The Pendle executions. On August 20, 1612, 10 people convicted of witchcraft were taken from Lancaster Castle to the gallows on the moors above town. Among them were 2 men and a woman in her 80s. The case had begun 5 months earlier when 17-year-old Alison Device encountered a peddler named John Law on a road near Pendle Hill in Lancashire. Alison, from an impoverished family known to practice folk healing, asked Law for pins, which were commonly used in magical remedies. When he refused, she muttered something under her breath. Minutes later, Law collapsed to the ground, paralyzed on one side and unable to speak. He had suffered a stroke, but both he and his son Abraham were convinced witchcraft was to blame. Abraham Law reported the incident to local magistrate Roger Nowell, who saw an opportunity. King James I was obsessed with witchcraft and had written a book about it. A successful witch prosecution would earn Nowell favor with the crown. When questioned, Alison freely admitted she had cursed Law. Worse, she began naming others, including her grandmother Elizabeth Southerns, known locally as Old Demdike, and members of the rival Chattox family. Nowell expanded his investigation. Old Demdike, who had been regarded as a witch for 50 years, confessed readily to decades of malicious magic. She described how a spirit named Tib had appeared to her 20 years earlier and offered her anything she desired in exchange for her soul. She admitted to causing deaths, sicknesses, and misfortunes throughout the Pendle region. Anne Whittle, called Old Chattox and matriarch of the rival family, also confessed under questioning. She claimed a devil called Fancy had been her familiar for years. Soon, both families were implicated, along with neighbors and acquaintances. On Good Friday, April 10th, many of the accused families gathered at a place called Malkin Tower. When Nowell learned of the meeting, he ordered everyone who attended arrested on suspicion of plotting to blow up Lancaster Castle, echoing the recent gunpowder plot that had nearly killed the king. 12 people were eventually charged with causing 10 deaths through witchcraft. One died in prison before trial. Old Demdike, 80 years old, could not survive the dark, damp dungeons of Lancaster Castle. 11 went to trial at Lancaster Assizes on August 18th and 19th. The court denied them legal counsel and allowed no witnesses to speak in their defense. The key prosecution witness was 9-year-old Janet Device, Alazon's younger sister. Normal rules of evidence were suspended in witchcraft cases, allowing such a young child to testify. Janet stood before the court and condemned her mother Elizabeth, her brother James, and her sister Alazon. When Elizabeth Device saw her youngest child giving evidence against her, she began screaming and cursing Janet so violently that guards had to remove her from the courtroom. The trials were swift. 10 defendants were found guilty and sentenced to hang. Only Alice Gray was acquitted. Alice Nutter, a wealthy widow who owned land and came from a respected family, maintained her innocence throughout but was convicted anyway. Some historians believe she was at Malkin Tower for a secret Catholic meeting and was caught up in the witch hunt by accident. On August 20th, all 10 were taken to Gallows Hill. Among them were Elizabeth Device, her children James and Alazon, Anne Whittle, her daughter Anne Redfern, Alice Nutter, and John and Jane Bulcock, a mother and son. They were hanged together, one of the largest mass executions for witchcraft in English history. The trials accounted for more than 2% of all witch executions in England between the early 15th and early 18th centuries. Young Janet Device disappeared from history until 1634 when a woman by that name was arrested again for witchcraft. Though eventually pardoned, she likely died in the same Lancaster Castle dungeons where her grandmother had perished 22 years earlier. The North Berwick Trials. On December 4th, 1590, Scottish authorities arrested and tortured dozens of people accused of attempting to murder King James VI through witchcraft. The trials began after the king experienced violent storms while sailing from Denmark with his new bride. Convinced that witches had summoned the tempest to drown him, James launched an obsessive investigation. Authorities arrested a maidservant named Gillis Duncan after her employer noticed she could heal the sick with unusual skill. Under torture, including the pillowinks, a device that crushed fingers, and having her head bound with rope until it compressed her skull, Duncan confessed to witchcraft and named over 70 accomplices. Among those she accused was Agnes Sampson, a midwife and healer from North Berwick. Sampson was arrested and subjected to brutal interrogation. Torturers shaved her entire body, searching carefully for the devil's mark. They fastened a device called the witch's bridle around her head, an iron cage with sharp prongs that pierced her tongue and cheeks. They deprived her of sleep for days. Finally, after being tortured in the presence of King James himself, Sampson confessed. She claimed to have attended a witches' sabbath in the North Berwick Church, where over 200 witches danced and plotted the king's death. She said they had baptized a cat, tied body parts from a corpse to it, and thrown it into the sea to raise the storm. The trials expanded to include John Fian, a schoolteacher who refused to confess despite having his fingernails ripped out and his feet crushed in the boots, a torture device that shattered leg bones. Fian was burned at the stake on January 27, 1591. Agnes Sampson was strangled and burned shortly after. Dozens of others were executed throughout 1591 and 1592. King James became so convinced of the reality of witchcraft that he wrote Daemonology in 1597, a treatise demanding severe punishment for witches. When he became King James I of England in 1603, he brought his obsession with him, leading directly to stricter witchcraft laws and ultimately to the Salem trials nearly a century later. The Santika Club Inferno. On January 1, 2009, just 35 minutes after midnight, 7-year-old Kui Ting Ting was celebrating New Year at the Santika Club in Ekamai, Bangkok, Thailand. The upscale nightclub was packed with around 1,000 revelers ringing in 2009. The celebration was themed Goodbye Santika, marking the club's last night before moving to a new location. Santika was styled like a Gothic church and was popular with young, affluent Thais, tourists, and expatriates from 13 different countries. As midnight approached, the band Burn took the stage for the countdown. Sparklers were distributed to guests who waved them together in celebration. The club also had a fireworks display planned for the stage. At 12:35 inches the morning, the pyrotechnics ignited. Within moments, flames spread across the ceiling. The fire had started either from the stage fireworks or from sparklers near flammable decorations. Witnesses reported seeing flames on the roof shortly after the outdoor midnight fireworks display. The ceiling and walls were covered with tar paper and plastic waterproofing materials that ignited rapidly. Most guests initially thought the fire was part of the show. By the time people realized the danger, thick black smoke was already banking down from the ceiling. The club had only one main exit door for the 1,000 people inside. A second staff exit was available, but a third emergency exit had been locked to prevent robberies. Panic erupted as the crowd surged toward the front entrance. People fell and were trampled as others climbed over them trying to escape. Sui later told reporters she had grabbed at what appeared to be cash being thrown from a window, only to discover they were nightclub coupons. But by then, people in front of her had already fallen to the floor with others stepping over them. The stampede at the single exit was catastrophic. Bodies piled up at the narrow doorway as flames raced through the building. Within minutes, the entire two-story structure was engulfed. Doctors later stated that fumes from burning plastic caused people to faint after just a few minutes of exposure. Sompong Tritawilap, who lived in an apartment behind the nightclub, watched in horror as young girls were pushed away and crushed underneath as others were stomping on them trying to get out. Bloodied, bruised, and burned victims were dragged from the burning building or managed to run through shattered windows. Emergency responders transported victims to 19 hospitals across Bangkok. Most injuries were from smoke inhalation and burns. The death toll reached 67 people with another 222 injured. Forensic reports showed that 88% of those who died suffered from asphyxiation, while 10% died from burns. Soot was found in the trachea of 95% of the deceased. Most of the bodies were discovered at or near the main entrance where they had been trampled or overcome by smoke. The club had only one fire extinguisher for the entire building. It was later revealed that Santika was registered as a restaurant, meaning it should have closed at midnight according to law. The club was also operating in a zone where nightclubs were prohibited, and the city architect's signature approving the club's design had been forged. Between 2004 and 2006, police had filed 47 charges against the club's owners for illegal operation. Suspicions of corruption arose when one of the co-owners was identified as a senior police officer. In 2011, club owner Wisuk Setsawat and pyrotechnics manager Bunshu Lauranath were found guilty of negligence. Setsawat was eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison in 2015. The Santika Club fire remains one of the deadliest nightclub disasters in Asian history. It was the 16th most fatal nightclub fire in the world. The Shanghai Bund Stampede. On December 31, 2014, around 300,000 people gathered along Shanghai's historic Bund waterfront to celebrate New Year's Eve. The Bund, renowned for its colonial architecture, is the former financial district of China's commercial hub and a popular tourist destination packed with high-end restaurants and expensive boutiques. Shanghai residents had traditionally flocked there to celebrate New Year. This year's countdown celebration included a light show, singing performances, and fireworks. The event had actually been scaled down and moved to a new location, specifically due to concerns about overcrowding after nearly 300,000 people turned out the previous year. At 11:30 inches the evening, just 30 minutes before midnight, a crush began at Chen Yi Square near a wide stairway leading up to a riverfront viewing platform. The steps were full of people. Some wanted to get down from the platform while others wanted to go up to get a better view of the midnight celebration. People were caught in the middle. A witness named Yin described seeing girls falling while screaming. Then people started to fall down, row by row. The crowd was in a panic. Zuo Zhijian, a media worker, later described the terrifying scene on Weibo. The heavy crush of bodies around him left him unable to move his legs. Someone grabbed his hair from behind, struggling and breathing heavily. A girl in front of him held him desperately and said, help me, please. I can't make it anymore." There was also a girl completely motionless underneath the pile of bodies. Another witness, 8-year-old Tian Ye, who worked in import-export logistics, had gone down to the waterfront because he lived nearby. He found himself only about 30 meters from the scene of the deadly crush. When he and other young men saw people had fainted, they rushed there to do CPR and carried them to ambulances and police cars. The stampede lasted only about 30 seconds, but it took about 10 minutes to carry everyone out. There were way too many people stuck down there without a clear entrance or exit. Early reports suggested that people had scrambled for fake money thrown from a third-floor window of the M18 nightclub. Confetti resembling US dollar bills with the M18 logo had been thrown onto the street. Some witnesses claimed several people rushed to grab what appeared to be cash. However, Shanghai police later clarified that surveillance camera footage showed the coupons had been thrown about 10 minutes after the stampede began and did not cause the crush. The stampede was actually caused by congestion on the steps as people going up competed for space with those coming down. Police admitted they had underestimated the crowd. Around 500 police officers had been dispatched, but this was fewer personnel than for previous events. Deputy Commander Kai Lixin acknowledged there weren't as many officers compared to something like last year's National Day celebration because yesterday there wasn't an official event. The death toll reached 36 people with another 49 injured, 13 of them seriously. There were 25 women among the deceased. Ages ranged from 16 to 36, with the average age being 22 years old. The youngest victim was just 12 years old. Most of the dead were young students and women. One victim from Taiwan was among those killed, and another was injured. Video footage showed people sobbing in hospital waiting rooms as relatives waited for hours for information about their loved ones. Photos showed people facing off with security guards at hospitals, desperate for news. President Xi Jinping ordered an immediate investigation. 4 officials, including the Huangpu District Party Chief, his deputy, the district security chief, and the deputy police chief, were fired. 7 other officials in tourism, public security, and urban management were disciplined. Families of victims received compensation of 800,000 yuan, about $128,800 each. As a result of the tragedy, all New Year's celebration events were canceled on January 1st, including the New Year's Marathon and Shanghai Tower Light Show. Similar New Year's celebration events were canceled for December 31st, 2015. The Manila Firecracker Tragedy. On December 31st, 2015, 30-year-old Ronald Vericio was celebrating New Year's Eve in Manila, Philippines. The Philippines has a long tradition of using fireworks to welcome the new year. It is believed that fireworks attract good fortune and drive away evil spirits. Despite a national law banning private use of fireworks, thousands of Filipinos still light firecrackers and pyrotechnics every year. Vericio had been drinking throughout the evening as midnight approached. He was in a festive mood as the countdown to 2016 began. In his hands, he held a large firecracker called Goodbye Philippines. This particular type of firecracker was classified as illegal and life-threatening. It was essentially a dynamite-like explosive device. Previous incidents had shown just how dangerous Goodbye Philippines firecrackers were. In December 2011, a 21-year-old man in Bocaue, Bulacan, had stepped on one accidentally, resulting in critical injuries and the amputation of his left foot. But Vericio, intoxicated and celebrating, made a fatal decision. As the firecracker's fuse burned down, instead of throwing it away, he embraced it against his chest. The explosion was catastrophic. The blast ripped through Vericio's jaw and caused massive internal injuries. Emergency responders rushed him to the hospital where doctors attempted to revive him. Despite their efforts, Vericio was pronounced dead. Health Secretary Janet Guerin announced his death as part of the Department of Health's annual New Year Firecracker Injury Report. The case became one of the most shocking examples of firecracker deaths during the holiday season. That same New Year's Eve period from December 21st, 2015 to January 5th, 2016, a total of 932 people sustained firecracker injuries across the Philippines. The number of injuries was 8% higher than the previous year, despite government scare campaigns showing gory pictures of past victims with their fingers ripped off by firecracker blasts. Most of the injuries occurred on December 25th, and during the 2-day period between December 31st and January 1st. Males accounted for 80% of those injured, and children aged 5 to 14 years were primarily affected at 47%. The most common injury areas were hands at 44%, legs at 21%, and eyes at 14%. Illegal fireworks like Goodbye Philippines, Triangle, and Judas Belt accounted for 50% of all injuries. They were also responsible for 100% of firecracker-related deaths during the 2010 to 2014 period. Blast injuries, not requiring amputation, accounted for 80% of total injuries, but 214 people required amputations. Most injuries occurred in street settings when people were lighting the fireworks themselves. A fire caused by firecrackers also gutted nearly 1,000 shanties in Manila that night. The government had been conducting awareness campaigns for years, promoting community fireworks shows sponsored by shopping centers and cities instead of individual use. One religious group, Iglesia ni Cristo, even set off more than 700,000 pyrotechnic devices trying to break a Guinness record for the largest fireworks display. Despite these efforts, the tradition of personal firecracker use continued to claim lives every year. Health officials had long pushed for a complete ban on household use of firecrackers but faced resistance from those who viewed it as an essential New Year tradition. The case of Ronald Vericio, embracing and exploding Goodbye Philippines, became a grim reminder of the deadly consequences of mixing alcohol with illegal explosives during holiday celebration. The Dubai Hotel Evacuation. On December 31st, 2015, thousands of people gathered near the Burj Khalifa in Dubai to watch what was billed as the biggest New Year's Eve fireworks display ever. The celebration would feature a 20-minute domino effect firework display shooting from the entire length of the world's tallest building. The Address Downtown Hotel, a 63-story luxury building comprising hotels and residences, stood just yards from the Burj Khalifa. It was a prime location for viewing the midnight fireworks. Around 9:30 inches the evening, about 2.5 hours before midnight, a fire broke out on the exterior of the Address Downtown Hotel. The blaze started from an electrical short circuit in a spotlight used to illuminate the hotel's exterior. The short circuit occurred in cables on a ledge between the 14th and 15th floors. Within moments, flames began racing up the sides of the building. The fire spread with shocking speed across the building's exterior cladding panels. Witnesses watched in horror as the fire climbed the tower, eventually covering nearly the entire 63-story structure. Strong winds fanned the flames upward, From the Burj Khalifa and surrounding areas, it looked as though the entire building was engulfed. Smoke and flames poured from windows as debris began falling from the tower. Inside the building, chaos erupted. Approximately 1,000 guests and employees were in the hotel and residential areas when the fire began. A stampede broke out as people rushed to evacuate. The crush of panicked guests and residents fighting to escape caused injuries as people were pushed and trampled. One elderly man suffered a heart attack during the evacuation due to the crowd and smoke. He collapsed at the scene and was later pronounced dead. Others sustained injuries from smoke inhalation as thick black smoke filled hallways and stairwells. The stampede itself caused additional injuries as people fell or were pushed in the chaos. In total, 16 people were injured. 14 suffered minor injuries. One person had moderate injuries, and the elderly man who suffered the heart attack became the fire's only fatality. Emergency crews worked frantically to evacuate the building and control the fire. Dubai Civil Defense deployed 4 firefighting crews from nearby stations. Helicopters and unmanned aerial vehicles were used in the rescue operation. Despite the massive fire visible across downtown Dubai, authorities made the controversial decision to proceed with the midnight fireworks display at the nearby Burj Khalifa. As flames continued to burn through the Address Hotel, creating a towering inferno in the night sky, the scheduled fireworks show went ahead at midnight. Thousands of spectators who had gathered in the area to watch the celebration found themselves witnessing 2 spectacles. The glitzy fireworks bursting from the Burj Khalifa, while just yards away, the Address Hotel continued to burn. More than 12 hours later, on the morning of January 1st, 2016, Dubai firefighters were still working to extinguish the blaze. At one point, they were unable to use water hoses on ladder trucks due to loss of pressure. Small fires continued burning through windows, sending smoke into the air throughout New Year's Day. Civil defense said cooling procedures were still underway. The investigation revealed that the rapid spread was due to the flammable cladding panels used on the building's exterior. Dubai and neighboring Emirates had faced a series of fires in high-rise buildings. In November 2015, a massive blaze engulfed 3 residential blocks. In February 2015, a huge fire gutted the Torch Tower in Dubai Marina. In 2012, the Tamwheel Tower burned. All of these fires involved exterior cladding materials. The Address Hotel fire raised serious questions about building safety in the United Arab Emirates. While Dubai officials emphasized that only 16 people were injured and praised first responders, critics pointed out that the death toll could have been much higher. The decision to proceed with fireworks while a major high-rise fire was still burning also drew criticism. The incident highlighted the dangerous combination of flammable building materials, inadequate fire suppression systems, and the pressure to maintain appearances during major public events. Internal fire extinguishers had prevented the fire from spreading inside the building, but the exterior remained a charred shell for months afterward. The Kim Kardashian of cartels. On September 14, 2015, 29-year-old Claudia Ochoa Felix was found dead in her bed in Culiacan, Sinaloa, Mexico. She had become famous on social media for posting photos with luxury cars, designer clothes, and assault rifle. Her Instagram showed a life of wealth and danger. Followers called her the Kim Kardashian of the Sinaloa cartel. Authorities believed she led a group of hitmen known as Los Antrax. On that September morning, family members entered her bedroom after she failed to wake up. They found her lifeless body lying peacefully under silk sheets. There were no visible signs of violence, no blood, no gunshot wounds. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but she showed no pulse. At the hospital, doctors examined her body carefully. They found traces of substances in her system that suggested poisoning. Investigators later theorized she had been given a lethal dose of drugs, disguised as recreational narcotics. The cartel world whispered that her own organization had eliminated her for attracting too much attention with her social media presence. She was buried in a lavish ceremony attended by hundreds. Her death was never officially solved, and no arrests were ever made. La Catrina's last stand. On January 9, 2017, in Puebla, Mexico, federal police surrounded a safe house where 43-year-old Maria Guadalupe Lopez Esquivel was hiding. She went by the name La Catrina and commanded a cell of the Los Zetas cartel. Intelligence reports indicated she was responsible for dozens of kidnappings and executions in central Mexico. Officers had tracked her for months through intercepted phone calls and informant tips. That morning, they moved in with armored vehicles and automatic weapons. La Catrina and her bodyguards opened fire immediately. The gun battle lasted nearly 2 hours. Neighbors reported hearing hundreds of rounds exchanged. Eventually, the shooting stopped. When officers entered the building, they found La Catrina dead in an upstairs bedroom. She had been hit multiple times in the chest and abdomen. 3 of her bodyguards also lay dead. Authorities recovered grenades, assault rifles, and large amounts of cash. Federal prosecutors later confirmed she had ordered the murder of at least 27 people. Her body was taken to the morgue and identified through fingerprints. The Mexican government celebrated her death as a major victory against organized crime. La Flaca's execution. On March 23, 2012, in Monterrey, Mexico, the body of 24-year-old Jocelyn Alejandra Niño was discovered on a roadside at dawn. Known as La Flaca, she had risen quickly through the Gulf cartel ranks by organizing drug distribution networks across the northern states. Witnesses said she had attended a meeting with rival cartel members the night before to negotiate territory disputes. She never returned home. Her boyfriend reported her missing around midnight. Search teams found her body less than 6 hours later. She had been shot 11 times in the head and torso. Her hands were bound with zip ties behind her back. A cardboard sign lay across her chest with a message warning others not to interfere in cartel business. Investigators determined she had been executed by members of Los Zetas after negotiations collapsed. Her family held a private funeral, fearing retaliation if they made a public display. Local newspapers ran her story for several days, highlighting the increasing role of women in cartel leadership positions. Police never made arrests in connection with her murder. La Madrina's final raid. On June 7, 2014, Mexican Marines raided a compound in Jalisco where 51-year-old Maria Guadalupe Martinez was directing operations for the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Known as La Madrina, she oversaw methamphetamine production facilities and supervised street-level dealers across 3 states. Intelligence agencies had monitored her communications for 8 months. That evening, Marines approached the compound using night vision equipment. As they breached the front gate, guards opened fire with automatic weapons. La Madrina reportedly grabbed an AK-47 and fired from a second-floor window. The battle lasted 45 minutes. When the shooting ended, Marines found La Madrina dead in a hallway. She had been struck 7 times by rifle rounds. 2 Marines and 4 cartel members also died in the operation. Inside the compound, authorities discovered 300 kilograms of crystal meth, 17 firearms, and financial records linking La Madrina to dozens of criminal enterprises. The government held a press conference showcasing the seized materials. Her death barely slowed cartel operations, as her second-in-command immediately took control. La China's betrayal. On August 19, 2013, 32-year-old Melissa Margarita Calderon Ojeda was found dead in a drainage canal in Tijuana, Mexico. She had operated under the name La China and managed logistics for the Arellano Felix cartel. She arranged drug shipments across the U.S. border and collected payments from American distributors. Colleagues described her as ruthlessly efficient and deeply trusted by cartel leadership. But in July of that year, authorities seized a shipment worth $12 million at a border checkpoint. Cartel bosses suspected La China had tipped off police in exchange for a reduced sentence on pending charges. They ordered her execution. On the night of August 18th, 2 men picked her up from her apartment, claiming the cartel boss wanted to meet with her. Instead, they drove her to an abandoned industrial area. There, they shot her 4 times in the back of the head. Her body was dumped in the canal and discovered by maintenance workers the next morning. Police found her identification still in her pocket. An autopsy confirmed she died from close-range gunshot wounds. Investigators learned through informants that her own cartel had killed her for suspected betrayal. No charges were ever filed. The nightclub massacre. On February 11, 2016, 26-year-old Jennifer Hermosillo Pineda was shot dead inside a nightclub in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. She had managed cocaine distribution for the Juarez cartel in the city's western neighborhoods. Friends said she often frequented expensive clubs and enjoyed the nightlife scene, despite the obvious dangers. That Saturday night, she arrived at the club with 3 bodyguards and several female friends. They took a VIP table near the back. Around 1 in the morning, 4 masked gunmen entered through the main entrance. They walked directly to Jennifer's table and opened fire. Witnesses said the shooting lasted less than 30 seconds. Jennifer was hit 8 times in the chest and neck. 2 of her bodyguards and 1 friend also died in the attack. Panicked clubgoers stampeded toward the exits, causing additional injuries. Police arrived within minutes, but the gunmen had already fled. Security camera footage showed they escaped in 2 black SUVs. Investigators determined the attack was ordered by the Sinaloa cartel, which was attempting to take over Juarez distribution network. Jennifer's funeral drew hundreds of mourners, many connected to cartel activities. Her killers were never identified or caught. Anel's last party. On May 4, 2015, in Monterrey, Mexico, 28-year-old Anel Noriega was celebrating her birthday at an upscale bar. She worked as a plaza boss for the Gulf cartel, controlling drug sales in several neighborhoods. Approximately 50 people attended her party, including other cartel members and their families. Music played loudly and drinks flowed freely. Around midnight, 3 vehicles pulled up outside. 8 armed men exited and stormed the entrance. They fired indiscriminately into the crowd. Anal tried to run toward the back exit but was shot 5 times in the back and legs. 13 other people were killed in the attack, including several innocent bystanders. The gunmen left as quickly as they arrived. Emergency services found a chaotic scene with bodies scattered across the floor. Anal was still alive when paramedics reached her, but she died in the ambulance before reaching the hospital. Authorities later determined Los Zetas had carried out the attack as revenge for a Gulf cartel operation that had killed 3 of their members the previous week. The bar was permanently closed after the incident. None of the shooters were ever prosecuted. Alma Rosa's ambush. On November 17, 2012, 40-year-old Alma Rosa Diaz Garcia was driving through Culiacan, Sinaloa, when her vehicle was ambushed by gunmen. She held a leadership position in the Sinaloa cartel's financial operations, managing money laundering networks that moved millions of dollars monthly. That afternoon, she left a meeting with cartel accountants and headed home. As her armored SUV approached an intersection, 2 trucks blocked her path from opposite directions. At least 6 gunmen emerged and fired armor-piercing rounds into her vehicle. Her driver attempted to reverse, but a 3rd truck blocked them from behind. The attack lasted approximately 3 minutes. When police arrived, they found Alma Rosa dead in the back seat. She had been struck 17 times. Her driver and 1 bodyguard also died. The armored glass had slowed but not stopped the specialized ammunition. Shell casings from AK-47 rifles littered the street. Witnesses reported seeing the attackers communicate through hand signals, suggesting military training. Investigators believed the Beltran Leyva cartel ordered the hit to disrupt Sinaloa's financial operations. Alma Rosa's funeral was attended by prominent cartel figures, though most wore masks to avoid identification. The case remains unsolved. La Gringa's prison execution. On July 23, 2018, 35-year-old Gladys Garcia, known as La Gringa, was stabbed to death inside a women's prison in Culiacan. She had been serving a 20-year sentence for her role in multiple cartel murders. Before her arrest, she commanded an assassination squad for the Sinaloa cartel. Prison officials said she continued directing criminal operations from behind bars using smuggled cell phones. On that July morning, during breakfast in the common area, 3 inmates approached her table. 1 distracted her while the other 2 produced sharpened metal shanks. They stabbed her repeatedly in the neck, chest, and abdomen. Guards responded within seconds, but La Gringa collapsed immediately. She was rushed to the prison medical facility but was pronounced dead within minutes. The 3 attackers surrendered without resistance. Investigators learned they had been paid by a rival cartel to eliminate La Gringa, who had testified against their members in exchange for a reduced sentence. Prison authorities launched an investigation into how the weapons entered the facility and how the payment was arranged. The 3 women received additional sentences for murder. La Gringa was buried in a private ceremony attended only by immediate family. Maria's gang war casualty. On October 9, 2019, 23-year-old Maria Jimenez Ortega was killed during a shootout between rival cartels in Guadalajara, Mexico. She operated a drug distribution cell for the Jalisco New Generation cartel in the city's poorest neighborhoods. That afternoon, members of the Nueva Plaza cartel attempted to seize control of her territory. Approximately 20 gunmen arrived in 5 vehicles. Maria and her crew returned fire from a safe house. The gun battle raged for over an hour with hundreds of rounds exchanged. Nearby residents fled their homes or hid indoors. Maria fought from a rooftop position, firing an assault rifle until she was struck in the head by a sniper round. She died instantly. When police finally secured the area, they found 8 bodies total, including 4 civilians caught in the crossfire. Maria's body remained on the rooftop for several hours while investigators documented the scene. Ballistic evidence confirmed she had fired over 60 rounds during the battle. Her family claimed her body 2 days later and held a funeral despite fears of retaliation. Mexican authorities called the incident one of the deadliest single encounters in Guadalajara's ongoing cartel war. No arrests were made. Juliana's torture death. On December 2, 2020, the tortured body of 31-year-old Juliana Escobar was discovered in a rural area outside Monterrey, Mexico. She had managed human trafficking operations for the Gulf cartel, overseeing the movement of migrants through northern Mexico. In November, she allegedly kept profits from a trafficking operation instead of delivering them to cartel leadership. Bosses ordered her capture. On November 30th, armed men kidnapped her from a shopping mall parking lot in broad daylight. Witnesses reported seeing her forced into a van. Her family received no ransom demands. 2 days later, a farmer found her body in a field. She had been severely beaten and showed signs of prolonged torture. Her hands and feet were bound. Cause of death was determined to be multiple stab wounds to the chest. A message carved into her skin warned others against stealing from the cartel. State police documented the crime scene and collected evidence, but the investigation yielded no suspects. Juliana's murder was recorded as one of over 35,000 homicides in Mexico that year. Her family held a small funeral and then fled the region, fearing they might be targeted next. La Emperatrice's military operation. On April 16, 2021, Mexican army soldiers killed 27-year-old Melissa Calderon, known as La Emperatrice, during a raid in Guerrero State. She commanded an enforcement wing of La Familia Michoacana cartel, responsible for protecting poppy fields and methamphetamine labs. Military intelligence tracked her to a mountain compound after months of surveillance. Soldiers approached at dawn using helicopters for rapid deployment. La Emperatrice and approximately 15 cartel soldiers opened fire immediately. The battle lasted nearly 2 hours with explosions from grenades echoing through the mountains. A military helicopter provided air support, firing on cartel positions. When fighting ceased, soldiers found La Emperatrice dead in a bunker beneath the main building. She had been killed by shrapnel from a grenade explosion. 7 cartel members and 2 soldiers also died in the operation. Inside the compound, authorities discovered weapons caches, cocaine processing equipment, and evidence of extortion scheme. The military displayed her body to media, confirming her identity. Government officials praised the operation as a significant blow to the cartel's leadership structure. La Emperatrice was buried in her hometown with minimal ceremony. Within weeks, another commander had assumed her position. Inez Oseguera's police confrontation. On August 29, 2021, 39-year-old Inez Oseguera Cervantes was killed during a police operation in Jalisco, Mexico. She was the sister of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Inez managed financial operations and supervised money laundering networks across multiple states. Federal police received intelligence placing her at a ranch outside Guadalajara. Officers surrounded the property at dawn with over 50 agents participating. As police announced their presence, gunfire erupted from inside the ranch house. Inez and several bodyguards engaged officers for approximately 30 minutes. An armored police vehicle breached the front gate, allowing tactical units to advance. Inez was struck multiple times during the exchange and fell in the courtyard. Officers secured the area and called medical personnel, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. 3 bodyguards and 1 police officer also died in the operation. Authorities recovered financial documents linking Inez to shell companies used for laundering drug proceeds. Her death was considered a personal blow to El Mencho, though the cartel continued its expansion. The government released photos of seized materials but withheld images of her body. She was buried quickly in a private ceremony with heavy security to prevent cartel retaliation against authorities. Her brother reportedly ordered attacks on police stations in response, resulting in additional casualties over the following weeks. Ruth's crossfire tragedy. On January 11, 2022, 25-year-old Ruth Moreno died in a shootout between the Sinaloa cartel and Mexican federal forces in Badiraguato, Sinaloa. She served as a communications coordinator, managing encrypted radio networks that kept cartel members connected across vast territories. That morning, federal police raided a suspected cartel safe house where Ruth was working. As officers approached, cartel guards opened fire from multiple positions. Ruth was in a ground floor room coordinating responses when a stray bullet entered through a window. She was struck in the chest and collapsed immediately. The firefight continued for another 20 minutes before cartel forces retreated. When police entered the building, they found Ruth barely conscious and bleeding heavily. Paramedics worked to stabilize her, but she died during transport to the hospital. Authorities later confirmed she had no weapon and appeared to have been attempting to hide when shot. Her death highlighted the dangers faced even by cartel members in non-combat roles. Federal prosecutors determined the bullet came from a police rifle, though the shooting was ruled accidental given the chaotic circumstances. Ruth's family received her body 3 days later and held a funeral attended by over 200 people. Local residents described her as someone who had few options for legitimate employment in a region dominated by cartel activity. The case received brief media attention before being overshadowed by subsequent cartel violence. No disciplinary action was taken against the officers involved. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.
He hears the crowd before he sees them. A man with tied arms is dragged into a town square and lashed onto a wooden wheel. The air smells like smoke and iron. An executioner raises a heavy bar. The first blow lands with a crack that silences the whispers. The second blow bends a limb in a direction it was never meant to go. Bones break, not all at once, but piece by piece, while the man is still alive and fully awake. The wheel turns. Another strike. The crowd flinches, then stares, because this is not a quick death. It is a lesson. The message is simple and brutal. This is what happens when you challenge power. The man groans, tries to speak, cannot. The executioner works with slow care, as if following a recipe. When it is finally over, the body is left on display above the road, so travelers will carry the story to the next village and the next. Pain is not an accident here. Pain is the product. Pain is the point. If this feels like a nightmare, it is also a mirror. Across empires and centuries, rulers shaped public life with public pain. They chose punishments that did not just kill, but spoke. Breaking on the wheel in parts of Europe, death by 1,000 cuts in imperial China, hanged, drawn, and quartered in England for treason, impalement along the road in Wallachia to scare invading armies. Whether every legend is perfectly true or half-true, the pattern is not in doubt. The state understood that a slow death could spread farther than any law. A slow death could move through a market, a church, a harbor, a battlefield, and settle in the mind. The body suffers once, the story suffers forever. That is why the hook of this history is not just the scream, it is the echo. Now the stakes. If rulers had not used these slow public deaths, many roads might have looked different. Power often sits on a thin line between fear and respect. Remove the fear, and rebellious nobles get bold. Remove the fear, and soldiers desert. Remove the fear, and rival faiths preach openly. These punishments were designed to hold that line. They were warnings for enemies and reminders for friends. They bought a season of order, sometimes only a season, by turning one body into a sign. But there is a second edge. The same spectacle that freezes a crowd today can stir it tomorrow. People remember. They talk. They start to ask whether a king who needs a wheel is a king who is weak. They begin to write laws that say, a state may punish but not torture. They begin to name a boundary, cruel and unusual. In that sense, every painful death is also a seed. It grows into fear, but it also grows into resistance. It grows into a new idea of justice. So this is not just a tour of horror. It is a tour of power. Each death we explore will show how pain was used like a tool, how it enforced order, started wars, ended wars, and then, over time, helped build a world that said, no more. If the wheel had not turned, if the cuts had not been counted, if the bodies had not been displayed, some laws we take for granted might never have arrived. But because they were, we can trace a hard line through history. From the square where a man breaks, to the courtroom where a judge says, this goes too far. That is why these stories matter. They tell us not only what rulers did to people, but what people eventually did to rulers.
He isn't the first, and he won't be the last. A ruler who feels his grip slipping does not give a speech. He gives the crowd a lesson. What follows are 10 lessons written on the body. Each one begins with a scene you could smell and hear if you stood too close. Each one explains who used it, why they used it, how it worked, what it changed, and why it still matters. Pain is the teacher, power is the subject, and the class is always full. On the wheel, a man's arms and legs are tied to the spokes like a cross pulled apart. An executioner swings an iron bar and breaks bones in a set order, turning the wheel to reach every limb. This was Europe's message to worst offenders for centuries. You did not just die, you were unmade. It punished murderers, rebels, and thieves who had become symbols. Authorities wanted fear to move faster than mercy. After the last blow, the broken body was raised as a sign at the edge of town. The wheel told everyone the same thing. Law can hurt longer than hate. The crowd learned. Then the rumor traveled further. In Imperial China, a man bound to a post faced a different script. Lingqi, often called death by 1,000 cuts, mixed pain with shame. The cuts were not random. They followed a ritual meant for crimes like treason or killing a parent. The point was not only to end a life, but to erase honor and disturb the family's memory. In a world where the body after death mattered, this was a second death. The state showed that betrayal would be answered with careful pain. The shock of it crossed borders and centuries, turning into stories even after the practice ended. The lesson lingered long after the knives were put away. In England, the sentence for treason stacked pains on top of each other. A traitor was dragged through the streets, hanged but cut down alive, opened in the belly, and finally quartered. The crowd watched, the church prayed, and the crown spoke without words. Break faith, and the nation breaks you. It was the theater of loyalty. Kings and parliaments used it in times of rebellion to harden soft edges. But the same spectacle that froze rebels also fed anger. Each public killing wrote a line in the long book that would one day argue for limits on punishment. Terror held the day, memory held the future. On the roads of Wallachia, long poles rose from the ground with bodies slumped on their tips. Impalement turned a frontier into a warning sign. Vlad III used it to stop invaders and to scare local rivals into silence. It was brutal, slow, and visible from far away. A wall built from fear when stone was too slow to lay. Armies found villages emptied by rumor alone. The method worked in the short term. Enemies kept their distance and thieves kept their heads down. But its shadow followed Vlad forever, proving that a ruler can win a week with terror and still lose a century of reputation. In Sicily, a story says a bronze bull stood above a fire. A victim locked inside screamed as the metal heated, and the sound came out like the bellow of an animal. Whether the tale is fully true or part legend, it shows something real about power. Cruelty loves a stage. The tyrant in the story didn't just want to kill, he wanted to turn pain into music. That detail, the shaped sound, explains why this myth survived. People remember craft applied to harm. They whisper it as a warning about leaders who turn punishment into art. Even if the bull never roared, the idea of it kept roaring in the human mind. On a quiet riverbank, two boats meet to make a coffin. A man is trapped between them, fed just enough to keep suffering, smeared with sweet food to attract insects. The sun does the rest. This is scaphism, told by ancient writers and doubted by many modern ones. But the doubt is also a lesson. Power loves to exaggerate its reach. It spreads tales of punishments so awful that truth does not matter. If people believe the story works. Real or not, the boats teach us how fear moves. By picture, by rumor, by the mouth of a traveler. Sometimes power needs only your belief to hurt you. On a ship, the sea itself became the whip. A sailor tied with ropes was dragged under the keel and pulled across barnacles and beams. Keel hauling was rare but unforgettable. It served as a floating court's last warning, discipline over death unless death came anyway. Captains used the threat to keep crews in line on long voyages where boredom and hunger could turn men against each other. The ocean made the sentence feel bigger than any judge. The cold, dark under the hull felt like a set of jaws. Sailors told the story in ports. Parents told it to boys who dreamed of running away. The Navy kept order with a ghost. On dry land, the stake raised its own ghost. Fire wrapped a body in slow light while the town looked on. Heretics, witches, and rebels faced flames that could be seen from every corner. The pain was not only heat, it was time. Moments stretched, and with them stretched the warning. The faith and the law are one, and both will burn you if you break them. But the burning also planted doubt. Some watchers felt the heat as a question. If our truth needs this flame, how strong is our truth? Over years, that question grew roots, feeding reforms that traded the fire for faster ends. In a stone chamber, a man is tied to a wooden frame. A crank turns. His joints lengthen beyond what skin and sinew can bear. The rack promised confessions and sometimes delivered only broken bodies. It sat at the center of many courts as a tool to pull words from silence. But pain-made words are weak foundations. They crumble under a new wind, and history looks back and sees a lie. The rack shows a state's impatient hunger for certainty. It also shows why later law leaned toward rules that kept confessions cleaner and shorter, so truth would not bleed out before it reached the page. Elsewhere, a prisoner is stripped and the skin is taken off in pieces. Flaying is a word people hate to hear because the image enters the body through the mind. When rulers used it, they were not just killing, they were drawing a map of power on a person. It was a sentence against enemies who needed to become warnings. City gates were the proof. The method survived as a whisper more than a record because people could not forget it even when they wanted to. Flaying reveals the simplest math of cruelty. The fewer the words, the deeper the memory. It is fear reduced to a single line. 10 segments, 10 ways to bend the will of a population by breaking the body of a single person. Under the wheel, inside the bull, over the stake, beneath the keel. Every method turned pain into policy. Some were common, some rare, some disputed, some certain, but all worked the same social nerve. They promised calm in return for screams. They bought order at the market price of mercy. And each one, in its own time, helped write the argument against itself. The more a ruler needed these lessons, the more people learned another one. There must be a line power cannot cross. They called it justice, but it was really a language. Pain was the grammar. Spectacle was the punctuation. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Rulers did not only punish people, they broadcast messages. A slow death in the square told every home that the state could reach inside your skin and write its rules there. That is the first system explainer: pain as policy. You make one person suffer in public so 10,000 behave in private. The tools change: wheel, stake, rack. But the purpose repeats. Humiliation is not a side effect. It is the design. Bodies are displayed, parts are sent to city gates, names are read out loud. The lesson is meant to travel like smoke. Fear moves faster than law, and fear does not need to be literate. It needs only eyes and ears. In that world, rumor becomes a deputy of the crown. People police one another because they dread becoming the next example. Power spends one life to buy many quiet days, but systems do not stand still. The second explainer is the shift from spectacle to clean killing, and then to the idea that cruelty should be limited by law. Crowds that once leaned in to watch began to turn away. Markets and churches did not want execution days to swallow their streets. Doctors and lawyers stepped forward to say that pain does not prove truth, that punishment can be quick and still be firm. Governments found that public horror sometimes sparked riot, not respect. So punishments moved behind walls. The language changed from shame him before all to process him according to code. Tools changed too. A drop, a blade, a bullet, fast ends that left less to see, less to gossip about. Then came a new word on paper: cruel, then another: unusual. Together they drew a line and said, beyond this line is not justice, but abuse. The message did not disappear. It moved into whispers of surveillance and cells. Still control, fewer screams.